That's William Z. Foster. Now, people may not have noticed, but when Chris Smalls began his heroic union efforts at Amazon, the Financial Times was forced to admit that the team of people that was trying to organize Amazon workers in Staten Island, New York, that they were reading a manual about how to organize steel workers, and that manual was written by William Z. Foster. When this was acknowledged in the Financial Times and in other publications, they referred to William Z. Foster as a forgotten labor leader. When you think of labor union activists in the United States, you generally think of what? Jimmy Hoffa, Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, Sweeney, you might think of George Meany or some of the old figures, but you don't think of William Z. Foster. And the reason that William Z. Foster is not generally mentioned is because you can't talk about William Z. Foster without talking about communism. You can talk about various labor leaders and their role, but William Z. Foster was not just the leader of the Great Steel Strike of 1919. He was not just the organizer of the Chicago packing houses. He was not just the ideological and basically the organizer and director of the Great Sit-Down Strike wave of the 1930s. He was basically Mr. Communism from the 1920s to the 1930s to the 1940s and up into the 1950s until his death in 1961. He was Mr. Communism. He was the face of American communism. And because of that, he's been kind of obscured, even though he was highly influential. So our first class this morning is going to be about William Z. Foster and who he is. And the reason that we're studying William Z. Foster is because this is probably one of the most successful communists in American history. I can't think of any communist leader who's achieved anything near what William Z. Foster achieved in the history of the United States. And so if we're trying to build a working class movement and fight for a government of action that fights for working families and build a working class socialist movement in the United States, we really ought to know what William Z. Foster did. We ought to learn from his achievements, his successes, maybe some of his shortcomings as well, and talk about him. In our first two classes, we're going to talk about two important communist activists in the history of the United States. We're going to talk about their successes, their failures, their strengths, their weaknesses, what they achieved, where they came from, understand them in order to later in the afternoon figure out what we're going to do in our time. So William Z. Foster, he was born in 1881. And his family, both of his parents came from Ireland. His father had been involved in the Irish freedom struggle and was basically forced to flee Ireland because he had fought the British and was going to face retaliation and possibly execution. So he fled. William Z. Foster, his mother bore 23 children, and only 9 of them survived. He was one of 9 who survived because they grew up in poverty. They were first in Taunton, Massachusetts, and then later in Philadelphia. And the conditions that his family faced in extreme poverty, I mean, you can imagine only 9 children out of 23 surviving. That's the kind of poverty that he grew up in. He was definitely from the working class. He was not a limousine liberal. He was definitely somebody from an impoverished working class neighborhood. And in fact, he talked about when he was a teenager, he was involved in a street gang called the Bulldogs that he was involved with. And they were involved in some kind of semi-criminal activity. And he started working at a fairly young age. And he had a number of jobs in his life. He was a lumberjack, he was a sailor, he was a streetcar driver. He had many different jobs. And the day that changed William Z. Foster's life was when he was living in Washington State. One day he was walking to work, and there was a soapbox agitator from the Socialist Labor Party. There was a man standing on a soapbox speaking to the masses about socialism. And William Z. Foster was walking to work, and he stopped and he listened to the soapbox agitator talk about socialism, and he stopped and he argued with him, and he debated him. And they argued for a little bit, and William Z. Foster became convinced that socialism and Marxism was the way to go. And so William Z. Foster was convinced by this street corner agitator. And because he got interested in socialism, he joined the Socialist Party, but then he got very involved in the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. And that was a labor union in the United States that organized quote-unquote unskilled workers. The American Federation of Labor, they existed, but they tended to only organize what they considered to be quote-unquote skilled trades. But the IWW, they believed in one big union for all workers. They were syndicalists, meaning that they wanted to organize the workers to eventually seize control of their factories. And so William Z. Foster joined the Industrial Workers of the World. And The IWW during this time was known for what they called their free speech fights, which are very crazy when you read about these free speech fights. And it tended to happen on the West Coast and in the heartland of the United States. There'd be some little town that would have a law, no socialist agitation in our town, no agitators, no speakers, no radicals in our town. Some wobbly organizer would go to the town and start giving a speech and get arrested. And so then the word would go out, and all the wobblies from all over the country would come to that town and one by one get arrested until the town's jails were full. Not only did people come to town and give speeches and get arrested, but there might be some windows broken and some vandalism. And after a while, the little town would give in and say, okay, fine, we can let folks speak. But the biggest of these free speech fights was the infamous Spokane speech fight of 1909. And William Z. Foster was involved in it. It was October 28th, 1909. There was an ad that went out all over the country, wanted men to fill the jails of Spokane, Washington. And on the first day of the free speech fight, 150 people got arrested. One by one, they started giving a socialist speech and dragged to jail. And by the end of the week, there were 400 people who'd been arrested. And then Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was based in New York, she went all the way out to Spokane. She was only 19 years old. She was a leader of the Wobblies. And she made a point, she wanted her arrest to be a little more challenging for the police. So when she got up, she chained herself to a lamppost and made the police have to cut the chains. That was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. So from October until March, people were coming to Spokane, Washington and getting arrested. William Z. Foster was one of those arrested. They finally, in March 4th, 1910, after all the bad publicity that they'd received, they ultimately let folks go. One of the interesting things was that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, when she'd been locked up, they had separate jails for men and women, she revealed that the police in Spokane, Washington were using the jail as a brothel and basically renting the women out there in order to make money. And that exposed the city and exposed the corruption. And William Z. Foster talked about how the jails for men were so crowded that they started using local schools. And they used local schools to lock people up. And that it was wintertime and they didn't have heat. And so they were locked in these schoolhouses basically with no heat. And that was the Spokane free speech fight. And William Z. Foster became a prominent leader of the industrial workers of the world. And one thing that William Z. Foster did was he started going to international conferences. So at the time in the world, you had the Second International, which was, that's basically what DSA is. It has an on and off relationship with the Socialist International. That's the German Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party of America, the British Labour Party. They were trying to get socialism through elections, right? Their idea was like Bernstein, we're going to gradually get socialism through elections. And so more radical forces tended to be associated with the Syndicalists. And the Syndicalists, their goal for bringing socialism was they said no politics at all. We don't vote. It's just about direct action on the job, right? The worker versus the employer. And we're going to organize one big union. And there's going to be one big union that has a big general strike, and the workers will seize their factories. And that's how they were going to do it. And William Z. Foster started going to international conferences because during this time you had the crisis of Marxism. Because Karl Marx long died, but after Karl Marx's death, Marxism was spreading everywhere. You had these huge socialist, Marxist groups, trade unions all over everywhere, but you didn't have a revolution. So something was wrong. So what was going to happen? And syndicalism and the anarcho-syndicalist, or that was one response to the crisis. You had other forces that said, well, this proves that there's not going to be a revolution. We need to just water it down one step at a time. And we ultimately know that it was Lenin who had the understanding that the problem was imperialism. It was that capitalism was entering its monopoly stage. The big corporations and banks based in the Western countries were dominating the world. As a result, they were able to stratify the working class at home, play the skilled against the unskilled, the white workers against the black workers, divide the working class, create the aristocracy of labor, and that was why you weren't seeing a revolution despite Marxism spreading. And it's also why you weren't seeing the big economic crisis that Marx had predicted. Marx's prediction was that basically that in the Western capitalist countries, the poverty and unemployment would just continue to grow, and capitalists would continue to enrich themselves while everyone got poorer, and eventually the workers would rise up and seize their factories. But as capitalism moved toward its monopoly stage of imperialism, you started to see a new layer of stability in Germany and France and the United States and other such countries. So as a result of that, you didn't see the revolutionary activity and the revolutionary crisis. But there was still an underlying economic crisis, no question about it. And ultimately, it was the underlying economic crisis that gave birth to World War I. So capitalism was still not stable, and World War I eventually resulted from the contradictions of imperialism, etc. But you saw a level of stability in the Western countries. And it's pretty clear that when he was going to these international syndicalist conferences in Europe, William Z. Foster was probably heavily influenced by George Sorel. And George Sorel was the figure in the syndicalist movement in Europe who was saying that the problem of Marxism was a spiritual one. He was looking at the French Socialist Party, looking at the German Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party, and saying that the problem was these folks are not making a revolution because they are trying to build a mass organization. They're trying to organize millions of people. You know, in a lot of towns, they'd have a socialist marching band, they'd have a socialist choir, they'd have a socialist Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and they were building these mass organizations. But in the process of doing that, they were watering down the message. And George Sorel was saying, well, what we need is an isolated group of fanatics who will engage in violence, and with their violence, they will inspire heroism. And George Sorel was openly opposing materialism. And he was saying that the problem, we need to appeal to mythology. And we need to appeal to kind of a spiritual kind of thing. And Sorel eventually joined a monarchist party. He thought the monarchy might, inspire people to go out and sacrifice. But Sorel was very influential in syndicalist circles. And it's probably because of Sorel that some of William Z. Foster's early writing is a little bit weird. For example, William Z. Foster, in his first pamphlet that he published about syndicalism, he advocated, he called himself a neo-Malthusian. And he wrote this. He said, "The syndicalist is a race suicider. He knows children are a detriment in his daily struggles, and he knows that rearing them is once again tying a milestone around his neck and furnishing a new supply of slaves to capitalism. He therefore commits the double error and carries on an extensive campaign to reduce births among the working class." That's William Z. Foster, the idea of the concept of the birth strike, right? With the idea the syndicalists were promoting this idea that in order to, not, drive wages down and have more competition for jobs, workers should not be having children. Well, obviously, the Marxists and Rosa Luxemburg and others, they critiqued this, and they said this is not correct, right? That Marxism seeks to increase the population. The problem isn't that there are too many workers. The problem is capitalism. But birth strike and some of these other concepts were spreading among syndicalists because they were questioning the widespread social democratic movements because they were ineffective. So William Z. Foster was a member of the industrial workers of the world. But the industrial workers of the world had a problem, which was that they would organize these very big strikes among textile workers in New Jersey and among miners in Colorado and elsewhere. And they would organize these strikes, and these strikes would be successful. But then when all their organizers got out of town, a lot of times everything that they won kind of slipped away. The Wobblies refused to sign contracts. They said if you sign a contract with your employer, you're recognizing your employer's right to exploit you. So they refused to sign any contracts, and they advocated only direct action on the job. They didn't make alliances with politicians. And on top of that, they tended to, they were openly revolutionaries, and so their union was pretty openly revolutionary. If people weren't down with what they were about, if they weren't all on board with syndicalism and the workers' revolution, it wasn't the right union for them. And so as a leader of the Wobblies, William Z. Foster started to realize that their tactics weren't effective. So he and a group of Wobblies that were around him broke away, and they formed something called the Syndicalist League of North America. And it was a breakaway from the Wobblies. And the reason that they broke away from the Wobblies is they said we need to go into the reformist unions. We need to go into the American Federation of Labor, and we need to bore from within. That's the term he used, bore from within. Meaning we'll join these reformist labor unions and try to push them in a more revolutionary direction. And we'll build what they called the militant minority, which was a group of workers in the union who were revolutionaries and radicals, but they would join the union, and through their efforts in the union, they could mobilize workers who maybe didn't agree with them and maybe had more conservative or right-wing ideas, but they could be the militant minority that would infiltrate the unions and push them in a more revolutionary direction. And that's what William Z. Foster was advocating. And the Syndicalist League of North America was a very highly disciplined organization. It was a group of very dedicated labor leaders who William Z. Foster had worked with, William F. Dunn, Jack Johnstone, and many others. And it was a group of people who had been involved in strikes and were radicals, and they said, we got to join the American Federation of Labor, we got to join the AFL, but we're going to infiltrate it and we're going to push it in a more radical direction. And they had a relationship with the Chicago Federation of Labor, the Chicago wing of the American Federation of Labor. And their first victory was they organized meatpacking workers. And the conditions of the meatpacking houses in Chicago were very, very horrendous. Low pay. It was largely immigrants from Ireland and Italy and Eastern Europe who were working in these meatpacking houses 12 hours a day. You had a lot of child labor. And the way they organized the meatpacking houses was they shamed the bosses. They basically put on these conferences where they had people get up and testify before the media and the press about how bad the conditions were. And they just humiliated the bosses, and the understanding was that if they would sign a union contract, they would end this negative publicity. And they never full-on, said they were going to go fully on strike, but they hinted at it. And the USA was getting ready for World War I, and World War I was happening, and there was fear on the part of the government that a strike of the meatpacking industry could lead to big problems. And so by kind of implying they might go on strike, and by humiliating the bosses and exposing the way they were treating the workers, the meatpacking houses of Chicago backed down, and they created the Stockyards Labor Council. And that was a union that represented meatpacking workers in Chicago. And it was very effective. And that was William Z. Foster's first great victory, was organizing the meatpacking workers. So then, as World War I came to an end, he got support from the Chicago Federation of Labor and others to organize the Great Steel Strike of 1919. This is the biggest steel strike in the history of the United States. 365,000 workers went on strike. And it was a national emergency. The military was called out in many places. Gary, Indiana, the military, and there were fights between the striking workers, and many parts of the country you had just chaos in the streets as workers were organizing and demanding their rights, demanding representation in the steel mills. And what's kind of interesting is that, as many people have mentioned before, that William Z. Foster was actually called to the White House, kind of like Chris Smalls was recently called to the White House. And Woodrow Wilson tried to get him to call off the strike and spoke to him in like a roughneck accent, assuming that he was an ignorant worker and couldn't possibly understand things. And on top of that, William Z. Foster was called before a congressional committee that was investigating labor unions and the role of communists and radicals in labor unions. And so he was called before this congressional committee, and they held up his pamphlet about syndicalism that I read to you from. And they read some of the more radical lines from it about overthrowing capitalism, etc. And William Z. Foster laughed it off, and he said, oh, I was radical back in my youth, but, we all are young once. They kind of laughed it off. Well, anyone who knows anything about William Z. Foster knows he was completely lying through his teeth. He was still very, very radical, but that was what they had to do. And so, in front of Congress, he said, oh, yeah, I was radical once, and it was very clear. The other thing was that the Stockyards Labor Council and the American Federation of Labor had supported World War I. We know William Z. Foster was very opposed to World War I. However, if he had been going around agitating against the war, as Debs was, or as others were doing, he would have been thrown in jail and their union would have been broken apart. So strategically, he pretended to support World War I while giving money and support to anti-war voices. Again, strategically. And when you look at what William Z. Foster accomplished in this first period of his life, you really are just struck by how hard it was to get workers in industry into unions, right? I mean, just to get basic union representation on the job in the steel mills, just to get representation in the packing houses, a lot of people died, a lot of sacrifices were made. And it's worth noting that the 1919 steel strike ended in failure. They lost. It was quite a lengthy strike. It went on for months. And ultimately, people started going back to work. It wasn't successful. The 1919 steel strike failed. And the main reason it failed was because of racism, because the AFL unions that were trying to organize the steel workers were whites only. And so in areas where the white workers would go on strike, they would use the black workers as scab labor. And William Z. Foster reflected on that in his pamphlet. And he said, this shows that racism hurts the labor movement. It hurts labor unions. And during this strike, he almost functioned like a military commander. He had an apartment in Chicago that became kind of like a military headquarters. It's where the strike was directed from. And he was He was on the phone and giving messages to people all around the country. It was almost like a military operation. People described him as almost like a commander or something. And it was this military operation. And it was largely unsuccessful. And after the steel strike of 1919 failed, he went back to work as a railroad worker. He had a connection in the railroad union, and he went back and he became a railroad worker. And he basically had lost out. A lot of people were quite disappointed in William Z. Foster. They felt like, he had done this great steel strike and it hadn't been successful, so he went back to work as a railroad worker. And he had been very frustrated during the strike because the Communist Party, that had just been formed, the two communist parties, the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party, didn't support him because he was in an AFL union. And because the strike had been organized by what they considered to be a reformist union, they hadn't supported the strike. And in Gary, Indiana, the Communist Party had done something particularly wacky. And they had put up posters all over Gary, Indiana, saying that, don't go on strike. What you need to do is organize a workers' militia and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. And you can imagine a lot of striking workers that are risking their lives and jobs and families looked at this poster and said, what in the world is this? And just, and it showed that the Communist Party was in its ultra-left phase, where it was dominated by anarchist and ultra-leftist elements who liked the Bolsheviks because they'd had a violent revolution, but were not actually understanding Bolshevik methods. So after William Z. Foster went back to work as a railroad worker, after the strike of 1919 failed, he got an invitation from Moscow, from the Soviet Union, to go to a conference of labor organizers that was being organized by the Bolsheviks. And when he went to Moscow, he learned that the communists in the Soviet Union had been urging the American communists to support the steel strike and had been pushing boring from within. They'd been pushing that all along. And in fact, a lot of the methods that William Z. Foster was using had already been employed by the Bolsheviks. They already had been building this kind of radical, the vanguard party of the most dedicated and committed, a party of new type. They already were going into unions that were reformist unions. And a lot of the same conclusions that William Z. Foster had drawn during organizing had also been developed by Vladimir Lenin. And that kind of shows that Marxism is scientific, right? That two scientists can do the same experiment in different places and get the same result. That Vladimir Lenin had come to the same conclusions when organizing the Bolsheviks as a militant minority, as a group of radicals that would go in and mobilize the broad masses of people. William Z. Foster had come to the same conclusions. So based on conversations with Lenin, sitting in Lenin's home, having extensive conversations with Lenin, William Z. Foster came back to the United States, and he was part of the founding merger that eventually established what is now called the Communist Party of the United States. And it was a merger of the Communist Labor Party, which was English-speaking workers. It was the Communist Party of America, which was the Foreign Language Federations. It was the Trade Union Educational League. That's what William Z. Foster called his labor organizer group at that point. They changed their name. They were no longer the Syndicalist League of North America. They were the Trade Union Education League. And there was also, at the founding convention of the Communist Party, there was something called the African Blood Brotherhood. And this was a group of black workers who had formed armed self-defense to fight the Ku Klux Klan. And they were led by Harry Haywood. And they saw that the Soviet Union was supporting the black freedom struggle, so they also merged into the Communist Party. And the Unity Convention was held in Bridgman, Michigan. And they had a convention, it was in the woods, you had to have a secret passcode to get in, all kinds of, invisible ink and decoder rings because the Red Scare was going on. And they had their convention in the middle of the woods in Michigan, and the FBI, or it wasn't the FBI yet, it was the government men or the Bureau of Investigation, raided it and arrested everyone there. And they were all charged with conspiring to overthrow the government, and some of them were convicted, and William Z. Foster was actually acquitted because there was a librarian on the jury who felt that his freedom of speech allowed him to be a communist. So he was actually acquitted in his trial in Michigan, but some others were convicted, including Charles Ruthenberg. So that's the first talk of the class about who William Z. Foster was in the lead up to joining the Communist Party and merging into it, about his efforts in the steel industry as well as his efforts in the meatpacking houses, his struggles with the Wobblies. So I thought this would be a good place to stop and have some discussion.
The thing is interesting about the IWW, and Lenin was critical of this, was their so-called dual carding approach, right? So there's no law that you have to be in only one union. You can be in multiple unions, right? So the IWW, you'd be a member of the IWW and a member of some other union. And the goal was to draw people towards the IWW as like the one big kind of true union. which is why I think it actually didn't necessarily achieve its goals, and why they had to split off of it, I think. Yeah, that's separate from the Bolshevik strategy, the Third International, of going into unions and agitating, but not trying to draw people into a separate union.
Yeah, right. And now if you join a union in the United States, every union makes you sign something against dual unionism.
Really?
Yeah.
Didn't know that one.
Yeah, still today, but go ahead.
Yeah, I find this like, and this is a pattern I find when researching Foster, some of these early communists, there's this kind of like pragmatism about them. Like they're very political. They're looking at the big picture. They're not like, a lot of modern leftists today don't look at like the big picture. They get stuck in like the minutia of tiny splits and details. But like with Foster, it's like this pragmatism. Okay, I'm going to line from this House committee because that's what's going to keep me out of jail and keep me on the streets organizing. So it's something that I think we need to really pick up as 21st century communists and socialists.
Yeah. Who else? Oh, go ahead.
I've been reading through the 1936 CPUSA organizing manual, and it stuck out to me as kind of like a cell structure. Did Foster get that from the Soviet Union in his visit, where he talks about whenever there's 3 communists in a factory that they should... Is that the boring from within that you talked about?
Oh. Well, the cell structure, that was how the Comintern organized, and that was the Communist International, and that's what's kind of different than, about the official communist parties that makes them separate from like other leftist groups, is that most communist groups have branches. You have a branch in this city, a branch in that city. The way the Communist Party, even up to today, is set up is they have cell structure. Now they call it clubs because that sounds a little more friendly, yes. Right? But the idea is that every member is a member of a club, and a club can have no more than 5 members, and then it has to divide into another club. And then there's an organizer of each club that goes and meets with regional people, and then there's a district organizer they meet with, and this is the way that every person is kind of directed. And that's the club structure or the cell structure. And that's because if you look at the communist parties, the way they're set up, it's almost like a military kind of organization, right? In the military, every officer has certain people he's over, and it's much more like that. A branch is kind of a loose association. I'm in the Chicago branch, I'm in the Philadelphia branch, we all get together and hang out and listen to some speeches. But the idea is that every member is like being fully utilized. So there's they're in a group of 5 with one person who's responsible for all of them. And that's why even today, like in France and places like that, the French Communist Party, if they have a rally, they can get thousands and thousands of people to come out because every person, there's somebody kind of on top of them making them do, etc. Right? And that's one of the effective things of the cell nature of communist parties around the world. And it separates them from some of the more looser and free associating left-wing organizations. But now, as far as what you're talking about boring from within was a strategy of going into reformist unions, right? The idea was we're not going to form a separate union. We're going to go into the unions and another point that you raised, which is interesting, is that, and a lot of people don't realize this, and we don't do this now, is that your club in the Communist Party was not based on the neighborhood you lived in. Usually it was based on where you worked. There would be a club in a factory. So you'd work in this factory, and there'd be 5 other communists that worked in the factory with you. And so you would be it was about your workplace. That was really about where you did most of your organizing, was in your workplace. Now later with the unemployed councils, et cetera, it became more about your neighborhood, et cetera. But the focus, if you read that manual, the organizing manual from the 1930s, it was about your workplace, your factory, your mine, your mill. You were organizing your co-workers. And one thing that I often think is that, when I'm writing something about socialism, I often think, how could I explain this to my coworkers? And that's the best way to think of it. Or when you're in college, think of how could I explain this to my classmates? Or how could I explain this to the people in my neighborhood? Right? Is this thinking for a mass audience? Right? It's extremely important.
Out of the movement
to the masses.
Out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement
to the masses. All right, go ahead.
So I think I'm phrasing this correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong. You had said that William Z. Foster made a strategic decision to support the U.S.'s presence in World War I. In what similarities and differences do you see that decision compared to today with principled communists either supporting Russia in its military intervention or at least having sympathy, if not outright supporting?
Well, I think it's a matter of strategy. It was division of labor. You know, Eugene Debs, he was the face of American socialism, and he went around publicly opposing World War I and eventually went to prison for it. And he was, sent to prison after giving an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio. And there were thousands of socialists who spoke against the war and went to prison for it. And people don't realize this, but I mean, it was completely illegal. There was actually, during World War I, there were a couple cases that are shocking in terms of free speech. For example, there was a movie, a patriotic movie that was made called The Spirit of 1776. It was a silent film. And it was called The Spirit of 1776, and it was supposed to rile up everyone to support the war. But it was about the American Revolution. It portrayed the British as the enemy, right? So they put the guy who made it in prison because he was hurting the war effort by portraying the British as the enemy. There was another case where some police officer or FBI guy or something, federal officer, his car broke down. So his car broke down in the middle of the country, and he went to a farmer's house to get help, with his car. And the farmer was talking to the government guy as he was, fixing his car, and made comments about, I don't really think we belong in this war. And it was in the privacy of his own home, and they put him in jail. That's how extreme they cracked down. And they had these groups of people whose job it was to go around enforcing the draft. Most people, if you were young and male, you got drafted. But if you were in with somebody and you had a tight relationship, you got to be one of the people who went around enforcing the draft. Right? That was the job you wanted to get. So you got to stay home, but your job was to go around looking for anyone military age and male and try to find out why they weren't in the military. And if they couldn't produce a card that showed that they had gotten an exemption or something, then they would be dragged to jail or sent to the military. So, and those guys, they would also go around selling, loans. They wanted people to buy, they called them victory loans or war bonds. And those guys would also suppress what they called seditious oratory. They were supposed to be on guard for anyone criticizing the war. And you have Supreme Court rulings like Schenck versus the United States, where somebody who passed out a leaflet encouraging people not to fight in World War I was sent to prison, and the Supreme Court ruled that was okay because it was a state of national emergency. And we all know that World War I started with a big lie, the Zimmerman telegram. Right? Mexico was about to invade the United States. The Germans had sent a telegram, allegedly, to the Mexicans, asking them if they would invade the United States. And the Mexicans had said, no, we're not going to, but this telegram, it's been questioned historically whether it even really ever happened. And that on the basis of the Zimmerman telegram, that was the basis of the USA getting involved in World War I. Woodrow Wilson had run for president on the platform of he kept us out of war. He wasn't going to lead us into World War I, and then he did. I think what was going on in the socialist movement at that time, it was a matter of division of labor. A lot of people went to prison for opposing the war. A lot of people made great sacrifices, and William Z. Foster and others supported them behind closed doors, and they gave them money and they supported them, but their job was they were to run the labor unions. And so their feeling was that if we are going to continue running the labor unions and build workers' organizations, we have to publicly make statements one way while behind closed doors we're helping somebody else. And it showed that they were much more serious than people are now. Right? They were much more serious. They said, okay, these people are going to go to jail for opposing the war, and these folks, they're going to say they support the war so they can build the unions that can actually build the movement. And there's a level of military discipline and seriousness about that is really kind of almost foreign to us. People don't act that way anymore. It's so much virtue signaling and all of that, but it was like, okay, we're going to have him say he supports the war so he can keep the unions. We're going to have this guy go to jail, and we're going to raise money for him, and this guy will go to jail. And it was a strategy. It was a strategy of actually getting things done. And I think that there's plenty we can learn from that, absolutely. And yes, the correct position was to oppose World War I. But for strategic reasons, Foster didn't publicly do that. And what's interesting is a lot of kind of ultra-left, Trotskyites and anarchists will point to William Z. Foster's statements supporting World War I as like, oh, we got you. And if you read The First 10 Years of American Communism by James Cannon, they just reprint his congressional testimony where they ask him if he supports World War I, and he says yes. Well, and it's supposed to be like a got ya. Well, the thing is that they wouldn't have asked him that if there wasn't extreme suspicion that he didn't. right? It was assumed you would support World War I. But if someone's before Congress, they're the leader of a radical labor union, they say, now, did you support World War I? It means everyone thinks you didn't. And if they then hold up your syndicalist pamphlet and say, this says here you want to overthrow the government, and you know, it was pretty clear that Foster was known to be a radical, no question about it. After the Russian Revolution and after the Great Steel Strike and after the Communist parties formed, William Z. Foster, because he had been the leader of the Steel Strike, he was like a celebrity because he led the Steel Strike, he became the most public face of American communism. And he organized the wing of the Communist Party that did labor work, was called the Trade Union Educational League. It was his Trade Union Educational League. And at the time, their strategy was to go into the existing labor unions, make them more radical. And so he was the enemy. He was like public enemy number one as far as the labor union bosses were concerned. At one point, he went to the American Federation of Labor's convention because he was the leader of the Communist Party's labor work, and he sat in the balcony. And the president of the AFL at the time was giving his speech about the labor unions, and he pointed to him in the balcony and said, there's one man here we want nothing to do with, William Z. Foster. He's a communist, he's a traitor, and we, the American Federation of Labor, we're patriotic. We want nothing to do with this guy. But it got a little more serious than that. For example, in 1923, William Z. Foster was organizing a meeting of the Trade Union Educational League, and they had to do this in secret, because if you were proven to be a member of the Trade Union Educational League, they'd kick you out of your union. So they had a secret meeting of workers of the Trade Union Educational League, and at that meeting, someone showed up and shot at him 3 times. Probably someone hired by these right-wing labor union bosses who were threatened by what he was doing. So he was shot at 3 times. Now, they didn't hit him, thank goodness, but they took 3 shots at him. That's how serious, you know, I mean, this was life and death kind of stuff. When the Communist Party was formed in the 1920s, it was very confused about what it stood for. You know, they first had this period of ultra-leftism where they were preaching violence and they weren't clear about doing mass organizing. But then in the 1920s, they were trying to figure out how they could have influence among the broad masses of Americans. And there was a huge amount of factionalism in the Communist Party. And factionalism is a little bit different than like political line struggle, right? Factionalism is more about you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And political line struggle is, well, I disagree with you, and this, but it was much more about I'm friends with so-and-so, and so-and-so is friends with so-and-so. And a lot of them were trying to get Moscow to say, you're the right one. And that was going on. And so they were both kind of, whatever Moscow would say, they would kind of outdo each other in trying to say it louder so that in the hopes that Moscow would appoint them the leaders. And William Z. Foster, he was the leader of one faction, and J. Lovestone was the leader of the other faction. And the two of them battled, and there's, you know, Stalin gave his speeches to the Communist Party where he attacked both factions. And the reason he attacked both factions is the J. Lovestone faction and the William Z. Foster faction were both calling themselves Stalinists. And Stalin said there's no such thing as a Stalinist. There's no such thing as a Stalinist, right? There's only Marxist-Leninists. Stop calling yourselves Stalinists and, you know, stop it and just get along, basically, was his idea. These two factions were battling each other, and it wasn't clear what they disagreed about. They were both basically doing the same tactical work, but they were constantly accusing the other one of not being loyal, etc. One thing that happened during this time was that you had the Farmer Labor Party. This was like an attempt to form a new, more radical third party that would be separate from the Democrats, the Farmer Labor Party. And so the Communist Party went to the conventions and tried to kind of take over and infiltrate the Farmer Labor Party. There was a Hungarian guy named John Pepper who was sent from Moscow to kind of advise the American Communist Party. And John Pepper, he argued that, that basically because the American people had very right-wing ideas and were backward, they shouldn't advocate communism. He said they should advocate the Third American Revolution. He said there was the revolution against the British, then there was the Civil War, and he said they were going to advocate the Third American Revolution. And he described the Third American Revolution they were going to advocate. And he said they would have elements of Bolshevism, Danish cooperatives, Ku Klux Klanism, and socialism. So that was what he advocated. And he had come up with this formulation. We're going to form this kind of populist movement that will somehow defeat, you know, and that was kind of voted down. But that was his idea, is we're going to form this Third American Revolution. And that obviously wasn't quite a hit. And that the Communist Party was quite reluctant to work around the black liberation struggle. The black liberation struggle was something that the Soviet Union said was so important. You have to fight for the rights of black people. But in many cases, because there was so much racism among the workers, the Communist Party was saying, can we not? We prefer not to, but the Comintern, the Communist International, was adamant, no, if you are in the United States, racism and black oppression is one of the main contradictions of U.S. society. If you don't do something about it, you're kind of, you know, you're missing the boat, right? Marcus Garvey was very popular at the time. And Marcus Garvey was a black nationalist leader, the Back to Africa movement, millions of followers. And the Communist Party's position was to support Marcus Garvey because he was fighting for the black liberation movement, because he was fighting for black people. And the Communist International took the position that black people actually represented an oppressed nation within U.S. borders. They were not simply victims of racial injustice, that black people were a colonized people that were being exploited. Just like they exploit nations around the developing world, the black people of America are being exploited as a nation. And that was the position that they took. And because of that, the Communist Party offered critical support to black nationalism. And they actually developed a little ahead because this is from 1932, but this is a Communist Party election campaign poster. I'll move this over. An election campaign poster from 1932. You know, it says equal rights for black people everywhere and self-determination for the black belt. And the idea was that in the Black Belt, in these regions of the South that are majority African American, they would have the right to secede from the United States and form an independent black republic. They were not advocating it. They said it was up to the people in these regions to vote for their independence. But that's how much they took the position that black people were an oppressed nation, that independence of the Black Belt was one of the positions that they took. So that's how much the Communist Party, even though there was a lot of reluctance from the leaders, that's how much they were focused on the black freedom struggle, which at the time was very much not a popular position to take. The Socialist Party of America was not taking this position. The Socialist Party of America, on the issue of lynching, they put out many statements that were almost neutral. They would say things like, obviously, you know, capitalism is an awful system that produces the horrible barbaric crimes of lynching, and also the antisocial elements who are lynched. They would make statements like that, trying to take both sides, you know. But the Communist Party was always clear they were for equal rights for black people. And that was not a popular position to take, but they took it. It's then worth noting that in 1928 you have the 6th Congress of the Communist International. And that's after Trotsky had been defeated. That's after Bukharin had been defeated. And 1928, the 6th World Congress happens, and that's when the third period began. The feeling was that following World War I, you'd had a period of revolutionary upheavals around the world. And then, after that, you had the Roaring Twenties, a period of capitalist stabilization. But then, in 1929, the third period began, which was a capitalist economic crisis, and this was the period in which they would go out and fight for revolution. And the position was that social democrats and reformist labor leaders were the main barrier, the main roadblock to revolution. So in order to combat them, it was necessary to focus on calling out the reformist leaders. And that meant that because the labor unions in the United States banned communists from joining, the Communist Party would form its own trade union federation, the Trade Union Unity League. And William Z. Foster said, all right, even though boring from within had been the position that he'd fought for, we're going to go into these unions, he said, all right, we're going to focus on organizing the unorganized into the Trade Union Unity League. Well, J. Lovestone, who was the leader of the rival faction of the Communist Party, didn't agree with that. And he said, his position was that basically the third period line, the 6th Congress, that applied to the rest of the world, but not to the United States. And he was accused of what? Stalin accused him of American exceptionalism. And he kicked him out of the Communist Party. American exceptionalism is now a phrase we use in the English language pretty widespread, right? Obama was attacked for not being an American exceptionalist. But the word American exceptionalism, the phrase American exceptionalism, actually comes from Stalin. It was the word he used to describe J. Lovestone. So J. Lovestone was kicked out of the Communist Party, and William Z. Foster became the leader of American communism in 1929 after the fight over American exceptionalism and the removal of J. Lovestone. So I guess we can talk about that. Folks want to pass the mic around.
I had a comment and a couple questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
You were talking about the pragmatism of William Z. Foster, and that reminded me of Assange. There's a great quote from Assange where he said, I'm not trying to be a martyr. I don't want to walk out in the street and nail myself up. I want to stay free as long as I can to do as much good work as I can. And that reminds me a lot of Foster because it exposes the liberal system. It forces them to show their hand and go against their supposed principles. I'm sure we'll get more into that as we go on. I was curious, I've heard before, was the Communist Party the first American party to run a black man at the top of the ticket for office? Not at the top of the ticket, but on
As vice president.
as
I
vice
believe.
president.
I think so, yes.
I think it was. Yeah, that was amazing to me. And could you just say a little bit more about the black belt? Because I've seen that poster before. I like to show it to people just to blow their minds that this exists. But I'm always a little scared to show it because I don't know what self-determination for the black belt means. I know you said a couple sentences on it, but what exactly were they going
Right,
for?
so
there?
it's the idea that, Marx said just workers of the world unite. There are no nations. But Lenin comes out with his understanding of imperialism, which is that, the Western capitalist nations are oppressing different nations around the world. And so, as Marxists fighting against imperialism, you support any nation that's fighting for its national liberation, even if they're not fighting on the basis of socialism, right? We support Russia in their struggle against the U.S. imperialists. Russia's not a socialist country, but we support them as a nation up against the imperialists, right? And the understanding is any nation that is fighting for its national liberation, you would support them against the imperialists. And the Communist International and leaders of the Communist Party came to the conclusion that black Americans constitute a nation, because they are segregated, they live in certain regions, they have separate religious groups, they have a separate dialect, that they constitute, the descendants of slaves living in the United States constitute an oppressed nation. And as a nation, they have the right to choose independence if they want, right? They're not demanding that they do that, but they have the right to self-determination. And you had figures like Marcus Garvey and later the Nation of Islam and others that were saying, yeah, as a nation, we want independence. So the Communist Party said, because this group of people are a nation and are oppressed, and because their population is concentrated in these particular regions of the South, it's actually called the Black Belt not because of black people, because of the soil, right? The reason that there's so many black people there is that's where all the farms were. And the plantations were because the soil there is particularly rich and very good for growing. And even today, it is still the highest concentration of African Americans. It's not what it once was. At this time, it's nowhere near what it was. But even today, there's still a huge concentration of African Americans in these areas. And because of that, the idea was that if these areas wanted to vote to break away from the United States, the communists would support that. And that was the position that they took. And that demand for an independent black belt was taken up by other revolutionary forces and other black liberation movements. For example, the Nation of Islam later advocated that. There was something in the 1960s called the Republic of New Africa, which was a revolutionary black organization that was demanding, they wanted to call the Black Belt the Republic of New Africa and have it be an independent territory for black people. And I believe a leader of the Republic of New Africa was elected mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba. He was part of the Republic of New Africa. But the position of the Communist Party was never that it was required, right? It was always that it would be up to the people there to choose. And that's an important distinction to make. And the reason that I think in this time it would not be appropriate for communists to go around advocating this kind of thing is because it sounds like segregation, especially from white people. If we're walking around being like, oh yeah, we want you to have your own country, it sounds like segregation, right? And that if there was a feeling among the black masses that they wanted this, it would be our duty as communists to support it. But right now there is not that feeling, right? There are some black nationalists who still advocate it, I think the African People's Socialist Party and others, and we respect their right to do it, but for the most part, the majority of the black community is not feeling that they want an independent territory. So because of that, we would recognize the right of black people, if they chose to do that, to have that, but at the same time, we don't go around promoting it. And the choice of self-determination, the choice of independence or integration, separation or integration, is up to the oppressed group, right? If black people want to integrate into U.S. society, they should be allowed to do so. And if black people want to separate, they should also be allowed to do so. And that's the principled communist position. At this time, because of the Marcus Garvey movement in the United States, and because legal segregation was in effect, the black community overwhelmingly did want self-determination, that black nationalism was the prevailing view, that white people will never give us equality and so we want to separate. But later, during the period when Earl Browder was running the Communist Party, the position, they backed away from this, and we'll get into that throughout. This is a very big, important debate that took place throughout Foster's life, the black national question. So there you go.
So this third period, right, of capitalism. Now this was a period of crisis, right? So I'm just thinking. So when Jay Lovestone believed that America was not in this period, was this before or after the great stock market crash?
The position of Jay Lovestone was that the policy of the Communist International in response to the economic crisis, which they came up with these policies a year before the great stock market crash. But there was already an economic crisis in Europe at that point. It just hadn't hit the United States yet. They came up with, in 1928 at their 6th Congress, this orientation that their slogan would be class against class. And instead of building a united front and trying to get socialist parties and anarchist groups to merge into one united front, they instead would do a united front from below aimed at the membership. They came up with these policies, and Jay Lovestone said these policies are not correct for the United States. The USA should not apply these policies. They might work in Europe, they might work in other countries, but in the United States, we can't attack the Social Democrats. And that was largely because of the fact that Jay Lovestone, like William Z. Foster also, had a huge following. He had a lot of people who were in the American Federation of Labor Unions working from within. And this policy meant they were going to have to pull all those people out, and that they were going to have to, start from scratch and organize the unorganized, right? Organize people who weren't in unions into communist unions and the Trade Union Unity League. And Jay Lovestone basically said, no, I'm not going to give that up. Little known fact, Jay Lovestone, he was kicked out of the Communist Party for American exceptionalism. He started his own group called the Communist Party Opposition, which was his group, and they were just the Communist Party Opposition. They had a newspaper called the Workers' Age, and they were just this other communist party led by Jay Lovestone that believed in American exceptionalism. And then starting during World War II, they started working for the CIA. And Jay Lovestone became the main labor organizer of the CIA. And in fact, the Solidarity dock workers movement in Poland was considered his greatest achievement. He had an office in the Reagan White House during the 1980s, and he became the main anti-communist labor guy for the CIA, which is a fascinating history. Yeah, Jay Lovestone. And they were called the Lovestoneites. That was his group. It was a network of labor activists who'd worked with Jay Lovestone. And first they were trying to be kind of aligned with the Communist Party, but outside of it. But the Communist Party was very hostile to them. And then they were working with the Trotskyites, and then eventually they worked for the CIA. And so another example, and this has come up in a lot of debates I've had. You'll often hear American newspapers make reference to the free trade unions. They'll say, in China, the labor unions are being suppressed. And then you point out, you say, actually, every worker in China is a member of a labor union. In China, it's illegal to have a workplace that's not unionized. You have Walmarts that have unions. And the strikes that have happened in China at Honda and elsewhere have been workers in government unions who, yes, they take control of it and move it in a more radical direction, but it is those government unions. So when they say workers in China are not allowed to join a union, what they're referring to is Jay Lovestone unions. The CIA has these free trade unions in China that are funded by the American government. And actually, the AFL-CIO has something called the Solidarity Center, or the Solidarity House, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy and operated by the AFL-CIO to set up labor unions around the world that serve U.S. foreign policy. And they started this during the Cold War. And Jay Lovestone is the guy that directs that, or directed it. He's dead now, but he was the guy who started those efforts.
I've heard you talk a little bit about Jay Lovestone and how it was kind of a tragedy, I feel like, in some ways that, he kind of split and then, they just, I don't know. Can you give any insight into that and, how, I feel like, sometimes how, I guess, radical politics can split and split and split and split and split, and it feels like that there's no way to overcome that. Can you give us a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's a tragedy, because if you look at, Jay Lovestone, he was kicked out in 1928. He had the Communist Party Opposition, which was thousands of people. It was several thousand people, and they were just this other communist party. And it wasn't until the late 1930s that he became a full-on anti-communist. And for a while, he was just trying to have this other communist party that supported Stalin and supported the Soviet Union. And there was hope that they could rejoin. They were convinced the Communist Party would eventually let them rejoin, and they wouldn't. And that there is kind of an attitude, and this is a problem especially with the Moscow, official Soviet parties. You're with us or against us. We're the real deal. We're the real party. If you're not with us, well, screw you, right? And a lot of it was ultimately that, kind of the problems they had even before the split. They were all fighting for Moscow's approval, right? And this is why you get a lot of radical folks who will say things like, we want to bring back the Communist International. I don't agree with that. In a lot of ways, despite the fact the Communist Party did amazing things during the 1920s and 30s, the Communist International, in a lot of ways, was being directed by the Soviet Union. And there are things that communist parties in countries that are trying to organize workers and make a revolution want to do that might not be in the interest of different countries. You know what I'm saying? And you know, if the Communist Party is constantly trying to get Moscow's approval, it may actually prevent them from doing work that needs to be done. So I don't advocate bringing back the Communist International. When the Communist International was dissolved during World War II, Mao said it was a great thing. He said because they hadn't been obeying them for years. You know, the Communist International tried to fire Mao Zedong many times. They would send him a letter saying, "You're no longer the leader of the Chinese Communist Party," and he would rip it up. He would rip it up and say, "Well, I'm in charge of the army, so screw you." You know, and Stalin realized this, that having the Communist International, it may have been necessary to give guidance, to teach Bolshevik policies and methods, but at the end of the day, the Communist parties around the world, in order to do the work that they needed to do, they needed to have an independent policy. And I don't think bringing back the Comintern is something people should do. It sounds radical, it sounds nostalgic, but at the end of the day, it's not helpful.
Does that mean that the Fourth International was fake?
Right. Well, after Trotsky was kicked out, eventually he started the Fourth International, right? And that there's about 7 different Fourth Internationals now that claim Trotsky's legacy. It's almost a rule that every Trotskyist group, they can't just start a group; they have to start their own international and be the Fourth International. So.
Yeah, I think what you're describing here with the contradiction between communist parties and the policy of the Comintern, I think it's expressing the contradiction between like geopolitical strategy and the realities of socialist countries versus like the political realities of like socialist parties in other countries. And sometimes those cannot intertwine. Like what may be good for like, say, you know, like the Soviet Union aligning, like creating an anti-fascist alliance with like, you know, France and Britain, that may kind of mess with the line of the French Communist Party or the Communist Party of Britain that's trying to, you know, build socialism in their country. So sometimes these things don't align always.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Dr. Shaw? No. Oh, okay. All right. Anyone else want to make a comment?
One last one.
Sure.
It occurred to me. Are you familiar with the Terry Bison novel? It's Fire in the Mountain or Fire on the Mountain.
I haven't read it. I've heard about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just know the general outline, and it kind of makes me think of this self-determination. I mean, it seems a little settlerish to advocate for it now, but the idea that if in the Civil War, John Brown, who were in Kansas, we got the poster on the wall. It's the idea if John Brown and Harriet Tubman had succeeded in helping the slaves liberate themselves. And if I remember correctly, it ends with some black astronauts on the moon in the 50s. And
Oh, wow.
because they liberated the means of production so much earlier, and they read they're reading a dystopian fiction novel called John Brown's Body, where a white man named Lincoln had helped in this inter-class war. It was an alternative. I mean, I don't know if I agree with everything in it, but it's an interesting idea to think how it would have been different if it had went that way.
I generally stay away from historical, coulda, shoulda, woulda, what if, because the reason, and this is just kind of a general philosophical point, but, we talk about the butterfly effect, right? If one thing changes, everything in our lives is so intimately connected to everything else. In order for one thing to have changed, so many other things would have had to have been different, right? You can think about your life and you'd be like, well, I made this decision back then, and if I had only made this other decision, but you made that decision for very specific reasons. Right? In very specific circumstances. And the more you start to get into that, oh, what if this had happened or what if that had happened, the more you get into that, the more you realize you can't do that.
It's paralyzing.
Yeah, and it's kind of a trap because the more you start to untangle it, this would have had to, for you to have made this different choice, this would have had to have been the reality. And also, since we talked about Trotskyism, Elizabeth gave a great class on Trotskyism, a lot of Trotsky's writing is based on that kind of thinking.
Really?
Yeah, if only Trotsky had been leading the Soviet Union, then there would have been a revolution in France, and then there would have been a revolution in Germany, and then there would have been that's Trotsky's writing is all like that. If I were in charge, everything would be fine. Well, we saw what was the reality when Trotsky was in charge. He didn't sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He completely screwed that up, We've seen what Trotsky being in charge was about, so I don't think it's safe to assume. And a lot of Trotskyists will say things like, well, if Trotsky had been in charge, Hitler would have never come to power in Germany. Well, if Trotsky had been in charge, and it's all based on this kind of, you can't really prove that. That's just,
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with criticizing, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, well, if this, if we could have done this better or something like that. But you can't get too caught up in, because every action that one takes has like, thousands and thousands of repercussions, right? And that's one thing when we get into like conspiratorial logic, like Alex Jones, people like that, they think there's this group of grand controllers who's plotting it all, and they said we're going to have a pandemic, and we're going to, and the thing that they don't realize is that, often on the part of our leaders, what we're seeing is a really sloppy, they don't know the results of their actions. They do one thing, and then it leads to something else. And then they try to fix it by doing another thing. And on top of that, there's not one group. There's different capitalists with different interests fighting against each other. And that conspiratorial logic, when it gets into it, it's all this grand plan. They made this decision. They knew exactly what everyone was going to do. No, there's no way you can know the result of your decisions, right? I mean, you can try, but when you make a choice in your life, you don't know what's going to result from that choice. So it's again, I always try to get people to stay away from that, because that's one of those brain worms that people can get stuck into. I guess we're getting self-helpy here, but that's okay.
Hey, I need some. Bring it on.
Yeah, there you go. Anyone else want to make a comment?
I felt goofy bringing up alternative history, but I'm glad I did.
It's a good novel from what I've heard.
I mean, it makes sense because you play any video game. I think there was some like Civil Iron 4 or something. And it's got Trotsky on the Soviet. It makes sense. They always see it that way.
Trotsky's like you throw the bowling ball wrong, and then you're like,
I think the way that you were putting the situation with William Z. Foster's congressional testimony in World War I, and putting that into the context of the times and how the consequences for opposing the war at the time. It was like if somebody said, "Do you support Al Qaeda today?" Like, of course you have to say no. Like, you don't get into the nuances of the situation. You just say no. Of course, I'm against. But it's just I just wanted to comment that how important it is that you put that into context, and how often pretty sharp intellectuals of the left today don't do that kind of thing when they're looking for a character from history that they want to either praise or condemn. They find he supported World War I. X. This is the sort of cancel culture reaction to history, which is also very much a present cancel culture sort of oriented reaction towards. People around, any pundits, intellectuals, leaders of any kind in the world on the left today, this kind of quick tendency to just find a flaw and then jump on that and then say, that person doesn't have it all figured out, and so therefore. I just wonder if you have anything to say on that.
Oh, I got my own mic.
Oh, you got mic, sorry.
Yeah. But we want to pass it back. Yeah. But I think you're right, David. You're absolutely right. And what's interesting is that people act differently when they're serious. When they think they can actually win, they act very, very differently. When activism becomes a necessity, not a way of making yourself feel good, not a way of being like, well, I want to feel like I'm the most revolutionary, people tend to act very, very, very differently. For example, right? If someone's running for office, they want as much support as they possibly can in their district. And they'll go around and, if someone says, hey, I'm so-and-so and I'm going to vote for you, they say, great. They shake their hand and they say, you're great. But now we have this atmosphere in leftist circles where if someone comes along and supports you, but they're not pure, you're like, no, get away from me. That's, again, when people think that they're going to win, they act very differently than when they're just kind of performing to try and make themselves feel good. And you can see that. And, there's that expression, politics makes strange bedfellows, that we often hear. And that really applies if you look at the history of revolutionary movements around the world. So do we want to have any more comments, or should I continue? All right. So March 6th, 1931 was International Unemployment Day. The Great Depression had happened. People were literally starving to death on the streets of America. And so the Communist Party started organizing the unemployed. And the slogan that they used was, "Don't starve, fight." Don't starve, fight. And they organized International Unemployment Day. And in Union Square in New York City, they gathered, and an eyewitness to the events, a young communist named Al Richmond, he recalled, William Z. Foster stood tall on the central platform, tall and erect, his figure etched the sun. And William Z. Foster had gathered this crowd of about 20,000 people in Union Square, unemployed people, hungry people. And he got up in front of the crowd and he said, Police Commissioner Whalen and the city officials have handed Broadway over to every monarchist and militarist exploiter of Europe, of Asia, to have a parade. But now, when the workers and the unemployed of New York demand to use the streets, Whalen's answer is that they cannot have them. Will you take this for an answer? And the crowd shouted back, no! He said, then I advise you to fall in line and proceed. And at that point, thousands of workers from Union Square poured onto Broadway. So they were singing the Internationale, and riot police officers charged them. The New York Times called it the worst riot in generations. The headline in the New York Times, I believe, was Reds Riot in Union Square. And thousands of people charged into Union Square, and there was a bloodbath, essentially. And they marched from Union Square down to Foley Square, through into Lower Manhattan, where Wall Street is. William Z. Foster was sent to prison for inciting a riot because they had told him not to have a march, and he had defied a lawful order and gotten up and said, we're going to have a march anyway. He went to prison, and at his trial, and he went to trial, at his trial, when he was defending himself, he said, the unemployed are not going to starve upon the streets. They are going to fight. The problem of unemployment is in its final analysis can only be solved by the abolition of the capitalist system and the establishment of a workers' and farmers' government. The Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League organized the unemployed not only for their immediate demands, but for this ultimate goal. So he basically is saying, look, I'm going to raise awareness about unemployment. I am going to call for socialist revolution. And, that's not a statement you want to make in your defense if you're on trial for inciting a riot, but he understood he was going to go to prison. He went to prison for about a year, and you can read in his autobiography, Pages from a Worker's Life. He describes the conditions on Rikers Island, what they were like at that time, very horrendous. He talks about, at the time, there was no LGBT movement, but there were a lot of LGBT folks, trans and gay and lesbian, that were in prison and the way they were treated and what that was like, which is very fascinating. He's writing about this in a different time. And it's very interesting. He got out of prison, and then in 1932, he ran, this election campaign, 1932 for president. And he published a book for his election campaign in 1932 called Towards Soviet America. And it's 5 chapters, and it's a great book if you can get your hands on it. It's an amazing historical document. I read it when I was 15. It was one of the most clear introductions to socialist and Marxist politics ever. Chapter 1 is the capitalist crisis and why the Great Depression is happening. Chapter 2 is the rise of socialism and how great the Soviet Union is and the 5-year economic plans and raising people out of poverty. Chapter 3 is capitalist attempts to liquidate the crisis, and he talks about the emerging police state and Bonapartism and different factions of the ruling class. Chapter 4 is the revolutionary way out of the crisis and the goal of the Communist Party to overthrow capitalism. And the last chapter is Chapter 5, the USSA, the United Soviet States of America. And he lays out the blueprint for what the United States will look like after the workers and farmers take power. It's a beautiful book. I really ought to get your hands on it if you can. It's a beautiful book, and it inspired Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, the great African-American poet, he actually wrote a poem inspired by it. He wrote, put one more S in the USA. Let's make it Soviet. Put one more S in the USA. Oh, we can win it yet. When the land belongs to the farmers and the factories to working men, the USA, once we take control, will be the USSA then. That was Langston Hughes. For his 1932 presidential campaign, William Z. Foster went around to every corner of the country to give speeches advocating socialism. And in every city he went to, he was arrested. He would be immediately arrested when he got to the city. The police would be waiting for him at the train station, and he would get out of the train, and they would immediately arrest him, and then they would proceed with his campaign events after he got out of jail. The 1932, yes. Yes, that was the year Roosevelt, that was the election that Roosevelt first won. Every place he would go, he would get arrested. The LAPD tortured him for hours, and he was severely injured. He was held and just tortured for hours by the LAPD. But he went to every corner of the country, West Virginia, the South, the North, many parts of the country, the West Coast, the East Coast. And towards the end of his presidential campaign, he had a heart attack and a complete nervous breakdown because it was just so stressful. On top of the fact that he was getting arrested and facing legal charges, he had pending criminal charges in a number of states. On top of that, the fact that, everywhere he went, the leaders of the Communist Party would want him to solve every local dispute and factional disagreement locally. And it was too much, and he had a heart attack. And he had a massive heart attack. And then, in response to his massive heart attack, there were rumors started in the media that he disagreed with the Communist Party leadership, that he didn't have a heart attack, that it was actually that he was in disagreement. And it was fake news, but it was some kind of psyop to try and sow division. They said, oh, Foster didn't have a heart attack. He just stopped believing in it. He knew how Stalin was so bad. It was all propaganda. It was all a hoax. But in response to his heart attack, he went to the Soviet Union where he could get medical care. And Earl Browder, who had worked as his secretary, stepped up to become the leader of the Communist Party. Earl Browder was kind of his second in command, and Earl Browder stepped up to be the leader when Foster had his heart attack. Now, Earl Browder, he became kind of the Communist Party boss of the 1930s. And Earl Browder was very different than William Z. Foster. Earl Browder was from Kansas, from this state, actually. And Earl Browder had, his father had been a Socialist Party member, and his father and his brothers had all joined the Socialist Party. And when World War I broke out, they decided to refuse to fight and go to prison. So Earl Browder, from Topeka, Kansas, he had refused to fight in World War I, and he went to prison. So he went to federal prison, and in prison, back then, there were not a lot of people in federal prison. This is before mass incarceration. And back then, federal prisons were actually nicer than local prisons. It's not like that now. And in federal prison, he actually got a degree in accounting. He learned to be an accountant while he was in federal prison. So he came out of prison with an accounting degree, and he also learned to play the flute. It kind of shows you, prisons are not like that nowadays, but back then, this was coming out of the progressive era. There was a feeling we want to really rehabilitate people. You can get your college degree in prison. You can learn to play the flute. He came out of prison with a college degree and an accounting degree, and he played the flute, and he came out and he joined the Communist Party. He was very close to William Z. Foster, and Earl Browder stepped up to be the leader of the Communist Party in response to William Z. Foster's heart attack. And so William Z. Foster was in the Soviet Union getting recovery. Earl Browder set up shop in New York City. Now what's interesting is that in 1928, when they launched the third period, Stalin had requested that the Communist Party move their headquarters from New York City, where they were based, to Chicago. Because Stalin said Chicago was more of the heartland of the United States, and that New York City is a very, cosmopolitan international city, but the goal should be to get to average people in the United States. So he'd moved the headquarters to Chicago, and that's where William Z. Foster had been based with his Chicago Stockyards Labor Council. Well, when Earl Browder took over the Communist Party, he moved the headquarters back to New York. And Earl Browder was the leader of the Communist Party. But a lot of things had changed, in the world. William Z. Foster had his heart attack. They had their 1932 presidential campaign, but Hitler had come to power in Germany. And in 1935, you had the 7th World Congress of the Communist International, where they redirected the policy to build a united front against fascism. The idea was, we've been fighting the Social Democrats and the reformist labor leaders in the past. Now we're going to align with them in a fight against fascism. We're going to align with them. And so the Communist International wanted Earl Browder to work on building the Farmer Labor Party. And the Farmer Labor Party, they argued, to be part of the Roosevelt coalition against fascism. Earl Browder said, no. In the United States, we can't have third parties. So he said, we're going to go into the Democratic Party. Earl Browder thought the Popular Front wasn't watered down enough, and he rejected that. And they went into he said the Popular Front didn't apply to the United States. He had what he called the Democratic Front by joining the Democratic Party. And they got rid of the black belt thesis, because the Democratic Party at that time was the party of Jim Crow. And it would hurt their influence in the Democratic Party to be organizing for the black belt and black nationalism. So the Communist Party backed away from its black belt thesis, which was something that many African American organizers in the Communist Party really particularly didn't like. Earl Browder ran for president in 1936, and he really played up the patriotism, right? His speeches would begin that if Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln were alive today, they would be members of the Communist Party, and that they are the true Americans, the inheritors of the American Revolution. And a lot of people think that that's Browderism. But actually, that was the line of the whole Communist Party. If you read William Z. Foster's writings from this period, that's how he was talking. And the socialist patriotism that was a big part of the Popular Front, that was very much the Communist Party's line. Browder had his problems, but that was the whole party's line, because the feeling was that fascism, and there was a real threat of a fascist military coup, And there was a feeling that in order to stave that off, they needed to show that the Communist Party were truly patriotic and that they weren't foreign agents, right? That was the slur always thrown at the Communist Party. You're agents of Moscow. So by playing up their patriotism and by having leaders like William Z. Foster, who was an Irish guy from Philadelphia, and Earl Browder, who he actually really played up the idea he was from Kansas. He called himself the man from Kansas. His election campaign song was the man from Kansas. Had Gus Hall, eventually he became a leader of the Communist Party during the late 30s. By playing up how American they are and having white guys from rural areas running the party, that was a way to play up, to stave off the allegation that they were foreign agents. And it was also a way to kind of preempt the fascist push that, that these communists are foreign agents, we need a strong government to crush the commies. It was the idea, well, we're the true patriots. We're loyal to the country, and that Roosevelt and anti-fascism, we're the ones who are really loyal to the country. It's fascism that's German or Italian, or this is the foreign ideology. Americans believe in brotherhood, different religious groups united, different races and ethnicities standing together. That's the American way. And it was very effective. And actually, during the Second World War, the Communist Party was very good at equating racism in the United States with the Nazis. And that was one of the main contributions that they made. There were a lot of Hollywood writers who were influenced by the Communist Party. And because they'd been given permission by the government to make anti-Nazi propaganda, they made a lot of short films that linked the Nazis to racism in the United States. And that was very, very effective. The Superman comics, I talk about socialist Superman. The Superman comics had Superman fight the Ku Klux Klan because they were sowing division and hurting the war effort, playing black against white to help the Nazis, right? You can watch, I think there was a song written by a communist, Robert Meerpool, or Abel Meerpool. He wrote a song called The House I Live In, which is like a patriotic song. And they made a short film with Frank Sinatra. And if you watch this film, it was made during the Second World War. It's like Frank Sinatra is walking around, and there's two kids that are bullying some other kid, and he walks up to them and he says, what's going on here? And the one kid says, well, we don't much care for this guy's religion. And he says to them, you guys must be some of those Nazis I've been reading about. And the kid says, no, my father's in the Navy, how dare you, or something. And then he sings this song about why racism is un-American and foreign. That was kind of the Communist Party's message. And it was a strategic way of inserting kind of a revolutionary message into the mainstream, right? The whole country is being mobilized to fight the Nazis. And so they strategically used that to push anti-racism and revolutionary politics. Now, the sit-down strike wave of the 1930s, which was so eloquently explained by Max yesterday in the class, William Z. Foster, he was back in the United States. He was still suffering from his heart attack. He wasn't at full capacity as he once was, but he was very much influential in it. He was directing it. And you see during the Communist Party in this time, there were two factions, right? You had William Z. Foster and his crowd of militant labor unionists. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who'd been a wobbly, she joined the Communist Party during this time. She held off a little bit, held on to her anarchism, but ultimately joined the Communist Party in the late 30s. And you had this crew of labor organizers who were like William Z. Foster, and they were for workplace action on the job. But then you also had this middle class layer of Broadway actors and screenwriters and college professors and middle class folks who were joining the Communist Party as well. And it's almost like there's two factions. There's the Browder faction and the Foster faction. Now, officially they had no factions, but it was very clear there was two types of people in the Communist Party. And that because Roosevelt was president, and Roosevelt was passing things like Social Security and unemployment insurance, and because Roosevelt was anti-fascist, it became more or less acceptable to join the Communist Party. Because by joining the Communist Party, you were supporting Roosevelt, you were opposing the Nazis. It was a sympathetic thing to do. And so they kind of watered down the requirements to be in the Communist Party. You just had to kind of go to a club meeting once a week, campaign for Roosevelt to get reelected, go to a union rally here and there. They kind of watered it down. And you had a lot of college professors, a lot of Broadway folks, screenwriters that were joining the Communist Party. And there was a clear feeling among the Foster folks that these folks weren't serious. That they were just these were artists and intellectuals. They weren't really serious about the revolution. And there was a feeling on the part of the Browder faction that William Z. Foster's people, they weren't really communists, they were crazy anarchists. They were roughnecks, they were radicals, they were extremists. They didn't understand that now we're building a democratic popular front, and there's kind of a rivalry beneath the surface between these two factions. And Earl Browder had the upper hand. And so Earl Browder did a lot to suppress William Z. Foster. because William Z. Foster was seen as his rival. They would have big rallies for the Communist Party in Madison Square Garden. And Earl Browder would be the main speaker, but William Z. Foster was loved. He was the face of American communism. They'd have him come out and wave, and everyone would applaud for him. Okay, go away now. And Earl Browder would give the speech, right? They tried to kind of keep him in the background because they thought that he was too radical. But then World War II broke out. And I guess I'll quickly go over what happened before World War II. So, Elizabeth talked about in her class about the Pact of 39. The Soviet Union had gone to every Western country to try and form an anti-Nazi alliance, and they'd all said no. And so the Soviet Union, seeing that they were under threat from the Nazis, said, okay, we'll make a deal with the Nazis. You guys won't make a deal with us, we'll make a deal with the Nazis. So immediately, the media went into an overdrive demonizing the communists. They've been saying they're anti-fascist for so long, but now Stalin made a deal with Hitler. That proves they're liars, they're a bunch of hypocrites. They started calling them commun-Nazis, etc. And so Roosevelt, who had been kind of aligning with the Communist Party and using them to support him against the Republicans and against the right wing, was very angry, and they framed up Earl Browder and sent him to federal prison for a passport violation, a minor passport violation. They claimed that when he'd applied for his passport, he lied on his form or something like that, and that he'd gone to the Soviet Union on a false passport. But if you read the question, it's not clear if they're asking, have you been someplace on a passport, or have you been... It was a frame-up. And they put Earl Browder in federal prison. And then when Earl Browder got out of prison, in 1940, they forbid him from leaving the state of New York for his presidential campaign because he was on parole. And so from the state of New York, after he got out of prison, Earl Browder recorded a vinyl record, and then they gave it to all the branches. That was where his campaign speech is. It's called The Most Peculiar Election. Because if you listen to this vinyl record, and I've heard a couple clips from it, and the speeches are published as a pamphlet. I really wish someone could produce this and we could record it. I think it'd be a fascinating historical document. But he's calling Roosevelt a warmonger. And he's saying that Roosevelt is just like Hitler. He's a fascist, and he's leading us into a war, and he's raising independence for Puerto Rico and talking about Puerto Rican independence, and they're playing up the danger of war and pacifism. There is a beautiful speech that I found from the 1940 campaign where Earl Browder he says that the United States should stop aligning with the British, and they should build a Washington, Moscow, Beijing axis, as an axis that opposes both the British and the Nazis. I think that's really cool. So Earl Browder, he got out of prison, he did his election campaign, but then, as we know, right, the Nazis didn't keep their pact with the Soviet Union. It's worth noting, you'll often hear, and I just want to throw this in because it's important, that there was an invasion of Poland, right? You'll hear that there was a joint invasion of Poland. What happened was that the pact that the communists the Soviet Union had made with Hitler, they drew a line down Europe, and it was halfway through Poland. And the agreement was the Nazis wouldn't put their troops on one side, and the Soviets wouldn't put their troops on the other side. So when the Nazis invaded Poland, they went right up to that line, and the Polish government collapsed. So it's worth noting that the Soviets then brought their troops right up to that line as well. And that was a defensive move because they didn't trust the Nazis. But the Polish government in exile, the Polish government fled to Britain in exile, the Polish government in exile never declared war on the Soviet Union. So this myth that we hear in mainstream media that it was a joint invasion, that's not true. If it had been a joint invasion, the Polish government in exile that declared war on the Nazis would have also declared war on the Soviet Union. But it was a defensive move. It was that most of Poland has been seized by the fascists, and they're going to bring their troops right up to the line and say you can't go any further. And there was a handshake at one point, but there you go. Go ahead.
The Soviets and Germans actually had like a couple clashes, border conflicts, like with each other, like on that borderline, because in a lot of places the Germans like went over the agreed line to seize like oil fields in like the eastern Poland, southern what's now Galicia and Ukraine. They actually went over a bit. So there were actual conflicts. So even though they signed the non-aggression pact with the Soviets, there were always disputes and conflicts during it. So like this idea that it was a red-brown alliance to split innocent poor Poland up and carve up Europe, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
So kind of similar to the situation in Ukraine, like right now, like basically the Kiev regime ignored the Minsk agreements, and the Russian military was forced to retaliate because like Nazis have been shelling Donbass for the past 8 years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, history is repeating itself, and we are all doomed to watch it repeat.
Indeed. Indeed. And now there's a big anti-Russian mobilization, just like there was in 1939. So yeah. So I want to finish with World War II, and then we'll open up for discussion. So do you want to hand the mic back? So during the Second World War, at the point that the pact was broken, the 1939 pact was broken, at that point the communists became very much supporters of building an anti-fascist alliance. And when Pearl Harbor happened, they ultimately supported the war. And it's worth noting, a lot of people criticize the Communist Party, and they say, oh, this proves they were agents of Moscow. They were against World War II, but then the Soviet Union got attacked, and that's also the position that almost all Americans took. Did you know that? Most Americans in 1939 were against any war in Europe. And Roosevelt's alliance with the British and such, and his sending of weapons to Britain and stuff, was unpopular. And at that point, most Americans didn't want to get involved. But then, when the Soviet Union was attacked, they thought, oh, wow, this Hitler guy is a problem. And it was Pearl Harbor that ultimately changed people's minds. And Pearl Harbor is ultimately what changed the Communist Party's mind. So the idea that they were just taking positions from Moscow, yes, defense of the Soviet Union was very important to them, no question about it. But the average Americans were also against the war at the same time the communists were, and the average Americans also changed their position at roughly the same time. So it's worth noting that. That the American public still had scars and wounds from World War I, and the idea of having a war was heartbreaking. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, my grandmother, who was from Missouri, she described how the principal of their school gathered the whole school like in the gymnasium, and he was a World War I veteran himself, and he started breaking down and sobbing because he had painful, horrible memories of being in the trenches of World War I. And that the idea of another huge world war was horrifying. The public didn't want to fight a new world war. War in the modern era, with poison gas and airplane bombers and machine guns was so horrific. The idea that having another world war was something that throughout the entire 1930s, the 20s, every politician was promising would never happen again. But when World War II ultimately started, when the United States was in World War I, the Communist Party, their position was to do everything for victory. However, Earl Browder, very much, he was the guy who was trying to get in with Moscow. So whatever Moscow said, he would try to do it 120 or 150% or maybe 200%. He went overboard with everything they said so that he could stay in charge against his rival William C. Foster. So during World War I, every member of the Communist Party that was an able-bodied male had to join the military. The Communist Party also complied with Japanese internment, which is pretty awful. They sent basically a letter to all their members that were Japanese and said, go to the internment camps and cooperate. That's pretty awful, and that was a horrendous error that was made, and it's something they shouldn't have done. In addition to that, in 1942, after the Communist International had been dissolved, Earl Browder said, well, the Communist International has been dissolved. Maybe we should dissolve the Communist Party of the United States. And William C. Foster and his supporters did not want to dissolve the Communist Party of the United States. So, they dissolved the Communist Party of the United States at an emergency convention. They changed the name to the Communist Political Association. And William C. Foster spoke up and said we shouldn't be dissolving the party. So to stick it to him, Earl Browder forced William C. Foster to read the proclamation dissolving the party, just to be mean to him. So that shows you, what a kind of a nasty guy Earl Browder was. So they had an emergency convention, and they basically declared, in order to support the war effort, we're going to dissolve the Communist Party. And that was the position the Communist Party was in towards the end of World War II. However, around the world, there were a lot of people that were listening to what the Communist Party was saying during World War I, what the U.S. Communist Party was doing. They didn't like it. One of them was Mao Zedong. And the Chinese Communist Party was particularly critical of the American Communist Party. One reason was that the Chinese Communist Party was always complaining about the fact that the USA was sending weapons to China to fight Japan, but all the weapons were going to Chiang Kai-shek and not to the communists. And so the Chinese Communist Party asked the American Communist Party to raise awareness about this. And so Earl Browder bought time on the radio and said it would be in the interests of the American people if we were to send weapons to the Red Army also, just as a courtesy, right? To make the point that arm the Red Army as well as Chiang Kai-shek's army. So then the U.S. State Department called Earl Browder to Washington, and he sat down with the U.S. State Department. And then Earl Browder went back and did another radio speech saying, oh, I made a horrendous mistake. This isn't true. I apologize. We are supporting the Red Army. This is just some confusion. And the Chinese communists were looking at this and said, we're not getting the weapons. This is ridiculous. And that was one incident that happened that showed that there were problems, and the fact that the Communist Party had been dissolved, etc. So then, in France, you had a communist named Jacques Duclos. And Jacques Duclos wrote a big article condemning Earl Browder for dissolving the Communist Party. And he pointed out that the Communist Political Association was very much not a revolutionary organization. The Communist Political Association, their ideology was Marxism, Jeffersonianism, rather than Marxism-Leninism. And during World War II, they had called for canceling the elections and just having the Republicans and the Democrats unify with a joint win-the-war ticket and not having elections because that would distract from the war effort. And then Earl Browder wrote his book Tehran, because you had the Tehran Accords, where Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt met in Tehran, and they were promising that after World War II, there would be a global anti-fascist alliance between the Soviet Union and Britain and the United States. And Earl Browder read this, Tehran, and read the Tehran Accords and was so excited about it, he wrote a book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, and declared that after World War II, there would be no strikes, because that wouldn't be necessary anymore, because the capitalists would realize that fascism was their enemy, so they would work with the workers against fascism or something, and that eventually the USA and the Soviet Union would merge into one country that would combine the best elements of both systems. There'd be elements of democracy, and the American system would be applied in the Soviet Union, and elements of socialism would be applied in the United States, and you'd have just one joint country between the USA and the Soviet Union. Well, most people in the Communist Party looked at this book, Tehran, that Earl Browder published, and they thought, this is ridiculous. This is the craziest insanity they'd ever seen. But Earl Browder had a lot of power, and if you challenged Earl Browder, if you opposed him, he would go after you. It took Jacques Duclos writing his article criticizing Earl Browder, and Stalin sending that article all over the world as a highlighted article that he wanted everyone to read, to awaken people in the American Communist Party to rise up against Earl Browder. And so as World War II was ending, they had an emergency convention to refound the Communist Party, and they dumped Earl Browder, and they drove him out of the party. However, what's interesting is that Earl Browder was given the opportunity that when he was outvoted on his Tehran policy, if he would simply go along with the new line, they would leave him in the party. But he refused. And the reason he refused is because he believed that Roosevelt was going to appoint him as the Secretary of Labor. He had been promised that Roosevelt would appoint him as Secretary of Labor at the end of the war, and so he was convinced that that was such a great post, and that Roosevelt, as a favor to the Soviet Union, would make Earl Browder the Secretary of Labor. And so he knew that changing their position, as the Cold War was going to start, it would ruin his relationship with the Democrats. And so because of that, he refused to back down. He was ultimately booted out of the party. They refounded the Communist Party in 1945 at their emergency convention, and the newly refounded Communist Party declared that American imperialism was the main enemy of humanity. They were opposing the Cold War, and Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, right? The Iron Curtain speech, an Iron Curtain, anti-communism. The day after the Iron Curtain speech, William Z. Foster had a rally of 20,000 people in Union Square, a rally for peace, a rally against a new war. 20,000 people marched with William Z. Foster in Union Square against the Iron Curtain speech, which I think is fascinating. So do we want to discuss now?
Fascinating topic. Because early in the war, Roosevelt and there was a dispute within intelligence agencies that were operating out in China. The Navy, the U.S. Navy Intelligence Agency, was actually backing Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT. And they were making sure the majority of the funding went to the Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, but Chiang Kai-shek was really corrupt, so a lot of that money got wasted and disappeared completely. Whereas the U.S. Army intelligence actually were kind of more in favor of the Chinese communists. There was this thing in 1944 called the Dixie Mission, where U.S. intelligence officials secretly actually went up to the Yan'an base area, and they met with Mao in Zhao Enlai. And the U.S. Army started secretly diverging funds that were going into China to the Chinese communists. They actually gave some weapons to the Chinese communists. And this is actually the first interaction between members of the U.S. state and the Chinese communists, and it's forgotten today. And during McCarthyism, after the Chinese communists won the Civil War in 1949, members of the Dixie Mission and the U.S. military were purged. They were fired from the U.S. military because they supposedly lost China by giving weapons to the Chinese communists and the Red Army instead of the KMT.
Wow.
Just interesting fact. So there was internal contradictions within the U.S. war effort in China between Army and naval intelligence. So just really.
I also want to mention there's a fun movie. It's not like epic film, but it's a fun movie to watch if you ever get a chance, made during World War II, called Gung Ho. where it's about a division of U.S. Marines who adopt the fighting style of Mao's 8th Route Army. It's very clear they got it from the 8th Route Army and Mao. They say so in the movie, and it's called gung ho. And actually, because of that movie during World War II, the phrase gung ho has become like an expression. It means you're really enthusiastic in the United States. It's a Chinese expression that means all together, all for one. That was a slogan of the Chinese Communist Party. And the U.S. Marine Corps made this propaganda film, gung ho, during World War II, and then it caught on in the United States, which I think is amusing. And Edgar Snow, who wrote Red Star Over China, was the first and last person to ever interview Mao. Edgar Snow, he was lobbying Roosevelt to give more support to the Chinese Red Army. And he also wanted Roosevelt to give money to the Chinese Industrial Cooperative Association. Because in all the areas that China had liberated, or that Mao had liberated in China from the Japanese, these were impoverished rural areas. But the Chinese Communist Party was already trying to get industry going. And so they had something called the Chinese Industrial Cooperative Association. And Edgar Snow was actually trying to convince Roosevelt to give funding not just to the military of China, but also to the Chinese Industrial Cooperative Association, which I think is fascinating.
For all Earl Browder's many faults, I think we need to study what he did right, because the Communist Party was somewhere between 85 and 100,000 and had immense influence on the left. It was the left. And Browder did support the unionization drives that the militant faction was supporting. If you know your labor history, the Communist Party was the leading organizers at the time for everything, pretty much. So what we ought to take away from Browderism, what did he do right? What did the CPUSA did right in the 1930s, as well as what they did wrong?
I think you're absolutely correct. And, Earl Browder's books are worth reading. When I was in college and I started getting interested in communism, I read Towards Soviet America, but I also read his book, What is Communism? It's called What is Communism by Earl Browder. In the first essay, Who are the Americans? It makes the case that communism is the most patriotic thing, and that Earl Browder was a master rhetorician. He was a very good speaker and a very good writer, and he would speak to anybody. The Roman Catholic youth organizations invited Earl Browder to speak, and he gave them a great speech. And he never would turn down any opportunity. And we mentioned that Benjamin Davis had been on the city council. They controlled 2 city council seats in New York City. Both of the seats for Harlem during the time were by the Communist Party. It was Benjamin Davis, who was African American, and Peter Coscione, who was an Italian. And also in Harlem was represented in the U.S. Congress by Vito Marcantonio, who was not a member of the Communist Party, but a very close friend of the Communist Party, a member of their fraternal organization, the International Workers' Order. And this was a member of the U.S. Congress who was reading the Daily Worker and communist newspapers articles on the floor of Congress. He's the one who proposed the anti-lynching bill that Joe Biden just recently passed, a little late, but he was the one who proposed it every time, and then the Democrats would vote it down. And he was elected. He had been a Republican, and then he switched to the American Labor Party, which was like an electoral ticket that was the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and some other groups. And he was in Congress throughout the late 30s and the Second World War, opposing war, defending the Soviet Union, etc. And the Communist Party had a huge amount of influence during these years. And it was because of a strategic alliance with Roosevelt. And I think it was correct. I mean, as we can be critical of Browder and how he carried it out, it was correct to align with Roosevelt. In 1936, if Roosevelt had not been reelected, the USA might not have been on the same side of World War II. The 1936 presidential election, I guess we're not supposed to do that, right? That's hypothetical, right? I'm a hypocrite now, but there we go. But the Roosevelt coalition, Wall Street wanted to remove Roosevelt for the most part. He had an alliance with the Rockefellers, but it was the labor movement, the CIO, that had his back, and the Communist Party, and the fact that Roosevelt was providing economic relief to people. He won the 1936 presidential election. And the sit-down strike wave of 1937 was very much a result of that election, because Roosevelt was reelected, and the employers and the factory owners from around the country were telling people that if Roosevelt wins the election, you're going to lose your job because he's taxing us too much. And so after Roosevelt was reelected, employers around the country started laying off their workers. And it was the workers who got laid off who then occupied their factories, demanding to keep their jobs. That was the beginning of the sit-down strike wave, first in Akron, Ohio, among rubber workers, and then in Michigan among the auto workers. And when Roosevelt embraced the sit-down strike wave and said it was legal for workers to occupy their factories and sent the military to Flint to defend the sit-down strikers, that was a big turning point. And that was like a signal to workers all around the country that you should go on strike, you should join a labor union. And they used to recruit, the CIO used to recruit people by walking around and saying, sign this union card, the president said you should. Well, it worked, right? The president said so. The president supports our right to occupy our factories, our right to unionize, and it was a very effective thing. Now, in the labor movement, they had control of the International Longshore Warehouse Union of San Francisco, and they had a lot of influence in the United Auto Workers, and there were some other unions, the United Electrical Workers, but they didn't have full control over labor unions. It's important to point that out. Most unions had a communist fraction. A fraction, they called it, a group of communists that worked in this industry and such, but they didn't have full control over the labor movement. And it's also worth noting that John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, was a Republican. He was a Republican. And it's also very interesting when people talk about the Trotskyites possibly being fascists or whatever. What's interesting is the Communist Party and the labor movement, they were aligned with Roosevelt, right? Whereas John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, and the Teamsters union, they were Republicans. The Teamsters are historically Republican. Well, what unions did the Trotskyites work in? The Republican unions, right? They worked in the Teamsters union out of Minneapolis, and they also worked in the miners' union, which was led by John L. Lewis. And so, and when World War II broke out, the communists were saying no strike, pledge everything for victory. The Trotskyites were saying, well, we want to have strikes and that, don't support a boss's war, etc. So the basis, the allegation that the Trotskyites were fascists was based on that alliance, that they were with the Teamsters and the United Mine Workers who had strikes during the war. The United Mine Workers did actually have wartime strikes that were put down, and the Communist Party helped put those strikes down because they said we got to defeat the fascists, and if we don't have the coal, if the coal doesn't go, we might not win the war. And that's the basis. And I will say that as much as I'm critical of Trotsky and Trotskyism, that probably the strongest argument in Trotsky's favor is some of the crazy pamphlets the Communist Party put out against Trotsky during that time. A lot of the anti-Trotsky literature they put out during those years is so over the top, and they're all Nazi spies. They're, it's a little bit, over the top. But essentially, the Trotskyites were trying to unionize the U.S. military during World War II, and for that they were sent to federal prison, for hurting the war effort, basically. So there you go.
Just brief thing is, hearing about this history and mistakes that were made along the way, whether it was Japanese internment camps or, the different factions having different perspectives. One thing I've liked about this group and that I want in a movement is, a kind of, it's easier in retrospect to see where people went wrong, but like in this moment, I know that there's something I have to be wrong about. Like I'm not 100% right. I can know that. So I just want to keep that in my mind while I'm out there talking to people that I could do something really stupid one day, and and I mean, knowing my past, I already have. So anyway.
I guess one question, I have two things. One, where can we find the What is Communism pamphlet? Because that'd be really cool to mass produce.
It's available on Amazon.
Oh, okay.
There's a chapter about the assassination of Huey Long. There's a chapter about Father Coughlin. There's a chapter on what the Soviet Union would look like,
Yeah, and in terms of the whole Trotskyist thing, I think the accusation that Trotskyists are connected with fascism, I think this comes from two areas. One, what happened in China with the Chinese Trotskyists. The Chinese Trotskyists were very ultra-left, and they aligned with, they tried to sabotage the Chinese Communist Party, and Mao talks about this, and even Ho Chi Minh talks about this, how they were basically bandits and dressed up in 8 Route Army uniforms and just robbed people and act as Japanese saboteurs. And then particularly in France as well, the French Trotskyists. The French Communist Party, when the Germans invaded, supported the government, even though the government was actually suppressing the French communists because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, whereas the French Trotskyists were saying, oh, take up arms against both the French bourgeois government and the Nazis. And there were a lot of French Trotskyists, such as, let me think, there's this guy Dorrois and Marcel Diet. There were people who claimed to be communists or Trotskyists in the 1920s and 30s, who later actually were very much like corporatists and collaborators within the Vichy regime. So it's very muddled, especially in World War II with Trotskyism in a lot of ways.
I made a few notes here. I just thought it was helpful to me. I first learned it from Wolf, but he recommended just explaining the history of the 30s. And a big reason I'm here was because he helped me see that behind every struggle, every civil rights, every labor movement, the Communist Party was there behind it, kind of being like, we're here. Don't forget about us. Pushing things forward, So that led me to look more into it. And as I grow in this, it's interesting to find the golden mean, You don't want to go too far left adventurism, but Browder teaches us you want to watch out for opportunism sometimes as well. And it's interesting, it's exciting to see it's kind of like that Stalin quote with Foster, I think American communists will remember Foster fondly.
Yes.
And that Chris Smalls is reading his work in this time is amazing. So,
Yeah. Absolutely. After the Second World War, the USA goes into McCarthyism. And McCarthyism was very, very extreme. Anti-communist hysteria. The National Board of the Communist Party are put on trial, and they used the 1945 convention where they dumped Browder and put Foster back in charge. They used that. That was the conspiracy charge. They conspired. And the charge, it was the Smith Act of 1940, which is a law that makes it a crime to conspire to teach an ideology that might lead one to the conclusion that you should overthrow the U.S. government. Now, you want to talk about a charge, right? They never proved that the Communist Party had ever advocated the violent overthrow of the U.S. government because they didn't. In all of their writing, they always said, we advocate a peaceful transition to socialism. However, they had conspired at this convention to give people books by Lenin that might lead them to believe you need a violent revolution. So basically, they had conspired to teach something that might lead someone to think something. If you want to talk about an Orwellian, ridiculous charge, what is particularly shocking is that after January 6th, CNN published this horrendous article on their website listing various times there had been attempts to overthrow the U.S. government, and they listed the 1945 convention of the Communist Party that they were convicted for. Now, if that doesn't reveal how ridiculous CNN can be, that's shocking. But 1948, the vice president during World War II had been Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace had been the Secretary of Agriculture before that, and he was anti-war, and he was progressive, and he was supporting the civil rights movement, civil rights for African Americans. He was supporting the struggle of labor unions, and he was wanting to maintain the anti-fascist alliance with the Soviet Union. He was opposing the Cold War. So Henry Wallace ran for president in 1948, and the Communist Party, they basically staffed his campaign. Henry Wallace was not a Communist Party member, but they said we got to do everything we can to support this campaign. So in 1948, you had a presidential election where Harry Truman was running for re-election, and Henry Wallace, the former vice president of Roosevelt, was running against him on a platform of opposing the Cold War, opposing McCarthyism, supporting civil rights. And it's fascinating, I think. So this is a time when the Communist Party, their name is mud. They're the most hated people in the country. They're being rounded up and put in prison. But even in this atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria, they managed to run Henry Wallace for president. Henry Wallace got over 1 million votes, and he impacted the election outcome because Henry Wallace was anti-racist. So in the North, where African Americans could vote, a lot of black pastors and a lot of black community organizers and black nationalists were voting for Henry Wallace. And Truman realized that in order to beat the Republicans, he needed votes in the urban centers of the North, in Chicago, in Indianapolis, and in Philadelphia. He needed people to vote for him. So Harry Truman took a dramatic move and integrated the U.S. Army, which was a very dramatic move, integrated the U.S. division. No longer black divisions and white divisions, integrated them. So in response to that, Strom Thurmond, the Southern Dixiecrat, formed the National States Rights Party and ran against Truman in the election on a platform of white supremacy, which was actually the words he used, I believe it was in their platform, white supremacy. So the Democrat vote in 1948 was split 3 ways in that election. Henry Wallace was the far left, the communist, aligned candidate. He was a progressive, but he was aligned with the communists. Truman was the regular Democrat running for re-election, and the National States Rights Party was running against them on a platform of maintaining Jim Crow. So the Democrat vote was split 3 ways. And there's a famous photo, Dewey defeats Truman. Have you ever seen that, where Truman is holding up this photo? There's a reason for that, because all the polling showed there's no way Truman could have won that election. If the Democrats' vote is split 3 ways, there's no way he could have won. But there's election fraud, and that's why he won the election, and that's why he's holding up Dewey defeats Truman, because in a lot of these urban centers, it was like 100% for Truman, a lot of these places. On top of that, a lot of the votes for Henry Wallace were not counted, and many southern states wouldn't allow Henry Wallace on the ballot because they believed because he was opposing segregation. So the Democrats got reelected, but it was because of communist intervention pushing Henry Wallace to run for president and supporting him that even during McCarthyism, they were able to split the Democratic vote 3 ways. 1951, they passed the McCarran Internal Security Act, which would round up communists and put them in concentration camps in a state of national emergency, right? Horrifying, utterly horrifying. And the Communist Party was basically forced underground. Nelson Peary was an African-American member of the Communist Party. They basically told him, you know, in order to keep functioning as a communist, you need to go underground. So he was in New York. They moved him to Ohio. And in Ohio, they told him to go to the Social Security office and say you don't have a Social Security card. And so he went in and he said, you know, I don't have a Social Security card. And they said, oh, you black people are never getting your documents in order. And because he was black, they gave him a new name and a new Social Security card. So he was a completely different person than he'd been. And he worked at a steel mill in Ohio. And then every Saturday, he would go and meet with his party contact at the library. He was like an underground member, like a sleeper or something, right? And then one day, his party contact didn't show up. And so he kept going back, and after a few months, the party contact never showed up, and so he was just kind of in hiding, you know, in Ohio, working in a steel mill. And a lot of people in the Communist parties, things like this happened. Now, the Communist Party was illegal and forced underground and heavily infiltrated by the FBI during these years. And one of the things that the FBI did, and I find this fascinating, is they waged an ID poll campaign. The FBI, it is proven, COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, they considered the Communist Party to be a wing of Soviet intelligence, so their anti-communist program was called COINTELPRO. They launched a campaign in the Communist Party to purge anyone accused of racism. And all kinds of members of the Communist Party were getting kicked out on charges of racism. Howard Fast, the very famous writer, he'd written Freedom Road and a lot of very great revolutionary novels. He had written an article for the Daily Worker in which he talked about little black boys and little black girls and how he wants them to grow up in a society with freedom. And they said that referring to any African American, even a little child, as boy is racist. And so he had to get up and apologize, and they almost kicked him out of the group. And we now know that this came from the FBI. The FBI was doing this as a way to sow division within the organization. Very interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting. And the Communist Party was barely functioning. The Daily Worker, it was illegal to send it through the mail. They were barely functioning. But then Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956 and condemned Stalin, right? And threw Stalin under the bus. And he gave that secret speech, and many members of the Communist Party thought it was a hoax. They didn't believe it because the US government had lied so much about the Soviet Union. They thought this could never be true. Well, the Communist Party, suddenly they were allowed to have a public convention. And in 1956, Eugene Dennis, who was the leader of the Communist Party, came out and said, yes, it's true. Yes, it's true. And they published a document called Communists Take a New Look, announcing they were going to have another convention in 1957. They were going to have a public convention in 1957. And they would discuss the possibility of becoming a mass party of socialism, dropping Marxism-Leninism, and cutting off ties with the Soviet Union. And at the meeting where Communists Take a New Look was presented, and where Eugene Dennis, the leader of the Communist Party, came out and said the secret speech was true, a lot of people broke down crying, and a lot of people quit the Communist Party. Because this was a group of people who had stayed loyal throughout everything, right? And through, they'd gone to prison, they'd been arrested, and then to have the leader of the Soviet Union get up and say that, oh, Stalin was bad, I guess the media was right, that was too much for them to handle. And what's interesting is we now know a lot of what was in Khrushchev's speech was not true. Right? I mean, he said that Stalin was so scared when Hitler invaded Germany that he started crying and hid under his desk because, we know Stalin was a bank robber, right? That didn't happen, right? What does Stalin mean? It's man of steel. Stalin did not break down and start sobbing and hide under his desk when he found out that the Nazis had invaded thousands of miles away. It was a lie. Khrushchev was saying that to the United States. He was saying Stalin wasn't a good ally during World War II. And that in many ways, Khrushchev's secret speech was groveling before the imperialists. He was saying Stalin was this extreme guy, this revolutionary, but I'm going to be your friend. I want to negotiate. It was a gesture of retreat to the United States. And Khrushchev came in with this idea that he would hold back revolutionary movements around the world in exchange for the USA having détente with the Soviet Union, lifting some of the sanctions and trading with the Soviet Union. So in 1957, then the Supreme Court went ahead and legalized the Communist Party. Yates versus the United States was their Supreme Court ruling. They said it's legal to have a Communist Party in the United States as long as they don't advocate the violent overthrow of the government, which they had never done. So there you go. So in 1957, the Supreme Court legalized the Communist Party, and they had their 1957 convention, which a transcript of the entire convention can be found on the Marxist Internet Archive. And the CPUSA published it as a book because it was such a controversial convention. Because the Communist Party was divided into 3 factions. The first faction was led by a guy named John Gates. And John Gates loved the Khrushchev revelations, and he said, this is proof that we ought to dump the Soviet Union, we ought to merge with the Socialist Party and just become a mass party of socialism. And the next faction was led by Eugene Dennis and Gus Hall, and they said, yeah, the Khrushchev revelations revealed a lot of bad stuff, but we should remain a Marxist-Leninist party, we should remain aligned with the Soviet Union, but go along with Khrushchev. And William Z. Foster's faction, they were critical of Khrushchev, and they said that Khrushchev wasn't totally correct and that this was problematic. There was also another major disagreement, which was the civil rights movement, because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been organizing the civil rights movement. But you also had Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and black nationalists that were organizing in northern areas that had a very different approach. And so there was a debate in the Communist Party, do we hold on to the black belt thesis or do we support the civil rights movement? And William Z. Foster's faction said we should support black nationalism. We should hold on to the black belt thesis, the right of self-determination, and we should support people like Malcolm X and others who consider black people to be a nation. However, the other 2 factions said they should support the civil rights movement, that black nationalism was divisive, and that they should just simply oppose racism. So that was the debate, and Eugene Dennis and Gus Hall, their faction, teamed up with John Gates to outvote the William Z. Foster faction. William Z. Foster was forced to become chairman emeritus, meaning you're chairman but you're retired. You basically have no role. And they kicked out a lot of members of the Communist Party, including Harry Haywood, Nelson Peary, and others who were holding on to the black belt thesis and were criticizing Khrushchev. After the convention, the John Gates faction started publishing anti-Soviet CIA propaganda in the Daily Worker and accusing the Soviet Union of atrocities in Hungary, etc. So Gus Hall and his faction kicked out the John Gates faction. So in 1957, the Communist Party was down to maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people at the most, right? And you talk about in the late 1930s, they'd been about 80,000 people. They were down to about 2,000 or 3,000. And Gus Hall, who had been in federal prison, he was kind of the leader. And they talk about how Gus Hall, he had been a militant steel worker organizer, had worked with William Z. Foster in Youngstown, Ohio to unionize the steel mills. He was one of the members of the National Board of the Communist Party who had gone to federal prison for violating the Smith Act, but he then tried to flee to Mexico, so the FBI apprehended him from Mexico, and so he got longer time than everybody else. And Gus Hall was the leader, and Gus Hall very much, he reminded people of the good old days. He was a very big, strong guy. He was from Finland, and he had been a labor organizer, and he had kind of a rural, Minnesota, Wisconsin accent, and he reminded people of the good old days. And Gus Hall was there, and it was a lot of those folks who'd been in through the years, and Gus Hall was there to say, we haven't surrendered, we haven't given up. But he was also saying that, we're not going to hold on to some of these radical ideas that Foster held on to. So after he was retired and he was older and he had continued heart trouble from the 1932 election, William Z. Foster went to the Soviet Union to get medical care, and in the final years of his life he was living in the Soviet Union. For his 80th birthday in 1961, they brought Khrushchev to visit William Z. Foster in his hospital bed for like a photo op. Khrushchev walked in and there, we greet you, great, American communist leader and all of that. So from his hospital bed, Foster pulled out a speech and read it. And it was a speech honoring Mao, because Khrushchev had just condemned Mao. And he gave a speech from his hospital bed honoring Mao Zedong. And everyone in the room fell silent, because they knew this was an attack on Khrushchev. And that was a bold moment, that his last act, basically, from his hospital bed, 80 years old, on his 80th birthday, he called out Khrushchev for condemning Mao. So when William Z. Foster died several months later, at his funeral, his state funeral in Moscow, Khrushchev refused to attend. But Brezhnev attended, and Brezhnev carried the casket, interestingly. And they had his memorial in Carnegie Hall in New York City. About 1,000 people were there. And George Lincoln Rockwell of the American Nazi Party protested outside with a sign that said, "One less red rat," and in full Nazi regalia was protesting outside. And now buried in Chicago. They sent his body back to the United States. His grave doesn't have the correct year of death on it. It says 1966 because that's when he was put there, but he died in 1961. And that's William Z. Foster, who is really, I mean, he was the pivotal leader of the Communist Party. You can't talk about American communism without him. And the fact that Chris Smalls is now studying his labor union organizing techniques, the fact that you can see an overlap between Lenin's methods and his methods, really shows you that this is somebody that if you're serious about making socialism in America, this is somebody we ought to engage with. We can criticize, we can learn from it, but this is a real giant of the working class. One of his biographies is called Working Class Giants. That's William Z. Foster. That's the first guy.
When in the 1956 speech to the 20th Party Congress, the so-called Khrushchev secret speech, depending on who you ask, either half or a third, approximately, of people left the Communist Party, and this is in most Western countries, and many of those people joined their local Trotskyist party. They went across the street. And there were divorces over the Khrushchev secret speech. I mean, this was the speech that shook the world. Its significance cannot be underestimated.
I'm sorry, honey, but I can't take it anymore.
Go ahead.
So it was mentioned when Foster met with Wilson that Wilson started to talk to him in like really rough English, thinking that's what he would understand. So what was the nature of Foster's education, and what would you say it was that led him to become such a leader that he was?
Okay, so I'll answer those few statements. As far as the Khrushchev revelations, some joined Trotskyist groups, but the biggest faction that quit was the John Gates faction that joined the Socialist Party, and a lot of them just went back to everyday life. What I think is fascinating is I believe the parents of Michael Moore were in the John Gates faction of the Communist Party. That is rumored, and I've heard that from multiple people who are communists in Michigan, that Michael Moore's parents were in the John Gates faction. And that there were a lot of folks who were in the John Gates faction who quit in 1956 or 57. But the Trotskyist groups did try to recruit. The Socialist Workers' Party and other Trotskyist groups did recruit some people, but not very many. And in the next class, we're going to talk about Sam Marcy and the role of Marcy, who was nominally a Trotskyite and all of that, and so we'll get into that. As far as Foster's education, he was a high school dropout. He learned to read, and that was very, very important. Because he did learn to read in school, he was able to start going to the public library. He became a religious skeptic at a young age. He read Thomas Paine and his criticism of religion and stuff, but he never completed high school. So and that was William Z. Foster. And yeah, he wasn't from Harvard, he wasn't from Yale. This guy was a salt-of-the-earth, working-class kid from Philadelphia. And I did want to read this. This is related to what you said, because William Z. Foster, in one of his books, he talked about what could I have done better in my life. And this is what he said. If I were starting out my life all over again, I would take the same course as I have done. But naturally, I would try to bypass the many political mistakes that I have made. One thing I would surely do, despite the press of practical work, would be to organize my time better, so as to enable me to indulge more than I have in the reading of science and history that I love so much. This is one thing that the youth in our labor and communist movement should most resolutely strive to accomplish, to combine theoretical work with practice, to find time for lots of reading, notwithstanding the urgent needs of the day-to-day struggle. And I also wanted to read this statement that he made. He said, I think party building is probably more difficult here than in any other leading country. In many lands, communists have been subjected to all sorts of persecution and hardship, and resolutely triumphed nevertheless. Our problem in this country is prevailing over the corrupting effects of lush capitalism. It is especially hard in this land of comparatively high living standards to make workers understand the flimsiness of American prosperity, the advantage of having communists lead them in daily struggles, and the eventual establishment of socialism. For American imperialism obviously exerts a corrupting influence over the minds of huge sections of the American working class. Marx long ago pointed out similar corrupting effects that British imperialism had on the minds of British skilled workers. But we American communists have never been dismayed by this insidious difficulty. We realize perfectly well that when capitalism in this country begins to feel the disintegrating forces that are now wrecking world capitalism, and it inevitably feels them as it must, then the working class, faced with rapid deteriorating working and living conditions, will swing swiftly and heavily to the left. Our party works and builds the framework for this sure perspective.
Bad options, like what was lesser evil? how did they think back then, and was that a concern or?
Oh, I think it's fair to say that coming out of the 30s, average Americans were much more politically engaged because of the starvation of the 1930s and people being on the streets in World War II, that there was much more of a willingness to engage about politics among average Americans, to the point that forming another party wasn't considered to be just insane. There, the Democratic Party, the Wisconsin Democratic Party, still to this day is called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, because in Wisconsin, instead of Democrats, they were electing farmer labor people, and that third parties had been more accepted during that time. So I think that might have been why that happened.
I just thought that it was really remarkable how William Z. Foster seems to really embody the principle of, if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change. Like, there was just so many different ways of organizing he adopted, and especially stood out to me in the 30s, in 1931, with his "Don't Starve, Fight" slogan, like comparing that to where we are right now with a looming hunger crisis, a worsening financial crisis, and a world war even potentially on the horizon. How thought-provoking and inspirational his ability to do that is for communists in America right now, when we've been so stagnant for so long.
I just wanted to mention, maybe you guys are more seasoned than me, but what's going on with Assange right now, my heart is in prison with that guy. And if it weren't for Marxism, I would have no way to explain the hypocrisy of this liberal, quote-unquote, state, that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, how can you be in a courtroom and you put that up on one side, and then you bring someone in and say, Espionage Act 1917. How is that constitutional? And you learn about this history, what they did. It just betrays the hypocrisy. And if it weren't for Marx and my understanding that, the state is the means by one class to oppress another, why are they bringing this back now? Are their profits threatened by Julian Assange? Is that why they're throwing freedom of speech out the window? What's going on?
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in the afternoon classes for
Good.
sure. But yeah, any other comments?
Thank you so much, Caleb. Thank you all very much. Wow, this was a great educational experience. Thinking about the 1930s and the great role that William Z. Foster played is, it's really inspirational. But I think about how. In the World War II situation, and the Communist Party USA was saying we need to defend democracy against fascism, and this was at the heyday of the Communist Party, and it was super strong and had a tremendous amount of power and influence on the left, and was part of the Roosevelt coalition, and. But I was thinking about this yesterday. Hearing this term defend democracy from the fascists. It really makes me think of the kinds of things that we're hearing nowadays. We're hearing today. But of course, the situation is extremely different. The Democratic Party now is far less labor friendly than it was in the 30s, of course. But we hear this: our democracy is in danger. Our democracy is under threat, and. Communist Party USA, it seems like nowadays, of course, it also is a smaller and weaker organization than it once was. We hear all of this, the Republicans are a fascist threat. Republicans are fascists. They're so scary. We got to keep voting Democrat. We got to support the Democrats. And I wonder, comparing, if there could be some value gained in, comparing and contrasting these situations. Thank you. I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, I think the best way you can compare this is that, back in, the 30s and the 40s, the Roosevelt coalition represented a kind of a popular front against the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Ford, and fascist Prescott Bush and fascist like-minded people. Whereas today, the Democratic... and in this context, the Communist Party in the 30s and the 40s was justified in entering a popular front with Roosevelt and forming kind of an alliance with him in order to get gains in terms of the labor movement and in terms of U.S. society in general. Nowadays, though, it is completely unjustified for a communist to enter a popular front with the Democrats. The Democratic Party is an imperialist party. It is actively eroding our civil liberties, our rights, and our Constitution. And a popular front in America is going to it's going to be defending our Constitution and our civil liberties, but it's going to be outside the two major parties because they're attacking our civil liberties and our Constitution.
You're with them, but they're not with you. A popular
Yeah, exactly.
is an